Three black stallions thundered down the dusty main street of Redemption Springs, their riders' long coats billowing behind them like dark wings against the setting sun. The horses' hooves kicked up clouds of dust as they approached the weathered facade of the Silver Spur Saloon. Eleanor Wells stood behind the bar, polishing a glass with practiced precision, her storm-grey eyes narrowing as she watched the approaching riders through the establishment's front windows. Her grandfather's finely crafted Colt Peacemaker remained out of sight but close at hand, tucked beneath the bar, where it had resided for the past 7 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Redemption Springs, a once booming silver mining town nestled in the rugged terrain of the Colorado Territory. The Silver Spur Saloon stood at the town's heart, its wooden structure weathered by years of harsh winters and blazing summers, yet maintained with meticulous care by its owner. The hand-painted sign above the entrance swayed gently in the breeze, the silver spurs depicted on it catching occasional glints of sunlight. Eleanor Wells moved with deliberate grace behind the polished oak bar, her movements economical and precise. At 42, her chestnut hair now carried streaks of silver that she wore without apology, pulled back in a practical bun that accentuated her sharp cheekbones and the quiet alertness in her grey eyes. Those eyes had seen more than most in this frontier town. They'd witnessed love and death, glory and despair, peace and violence, though few in Redemption Springs knew the full extent of what those eyes had beheld in her former life. The saloon itself reflected Eleanor's personality, meticulously organized, practical yet inviting, with subtle touches of refinement that set it apart from the typical frontier watering hole. Brass fixtures gleamed in the lamplight. The mirror behind the bar was spotless, and unlike many establishments of its kind, the Silver Spur's floors were swept clean twice daily. Patrons could enjoy their whiskey without the usual ankle-deep sawdust found in less reputable establishments. "Another Mrs. Wells?" asked Caleb Hopkins, a silver-haired prospector who'd been nursing the same glass of whiskey for the past hour. His weathered face split into a grateful smile as Eleanor poured him a modest refill. "Last one before dinner, Caleb," she replied, her voice carrying the slight refined accent of her Eastern upbringing, a detail that had fascinated the locals when she'd first arrived with her late husband Robert 7 years prior. Martha mentioned, "You promised to join her and the children for supper tonight." Caleb chuckled, caught in his attempt to delay the inevitable return to his sister's chaotic household. "You always did have a better memory than most, Eleanor. Nothing gets past those eyes of yours." Eleanor offered a small smile in return, though her attention had already shifted to the windows, where the 3 riders were now dismounting, their movements carrying the dangerous swagger of men accustomed to intimidation. Her right hand instinctively drifted toward the underside of the bar, fingers brushing against the smooth, walnut grip of the Colt Peacemaker hidden there, a habit formed long before she'd become a respectable saloon owner. As she watched the approaching men, Eleanor's mind performed the automatic calculations that had once been as natural to her as breathing. Distances, angles, potential obstacles, lines of sight. The old training reasserted itself without conscious thought, a skill set that had lain dormant but never forgotten in the years since she'd left her former life behind. The batwing doors swung open with deliberate force as the 3 men entered. Silence falling over the previously jovial afternoon crowd. Eleanor recognized the leader immediately, Jackson Wade, enforcer for the notorious Bishop Brothers gang that had been terrorizing small towns across the territory. His scarred face twisted into what might have been meant as a charming smile as he surveyed the establishment, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a predator sizing up potential prey. Eleanor kept her expression neutral, though her mind rapidly Processed details that most would overlook. The way Wade's jacket hung unevenly on his right side, suggesting a shoulder holster. The man to his left, known only as Cooper, according to territorial warnings, carried himself with military bearing despite his rough appearance, his eyes constantly scanning the room with professional assessment. The third man, younger and more nervous than his companions, had fresh bruises on his knuckles and a poorly concealed knife in his boot. "Gentlemen," Eleanor greeted them, her voice steady and measured, "welcome to the Silver Spur. What can I offer you this afternoon?" Wade approached the bar, his spurs jingling with each deliberate step. He removed his hat with exaggerated courtesy, revealing dark hair streaked with premature grey. "Mrs. Wells, I presume. Your establishment's reputation for fine whiskey precedes it." His voice carried a cultivated smoothness that didn't match the hardness in his eyes. "You have me at a disadvantage, sir," Eleanor replied, though she knew precisely who he was. The saloon had fallen almost completely silent, the regular patrons sensing the tension that now filled the room. "Jackson Wade, at your service." He performed a slight bow. "My associates and I are merely passing through your charming town and thought to sample the local hospitality." Eleanor's hands moved with practiced efficiency, setting out 3 glasses and filling them with her better whiskey. Not the best she kept reserved for special occasions, but good enough to avoid giving offense. Her movements were unhurried, controlled, though her senses remained heightened, cataloguing every detail of the 3 men before her. "First drinks in the house," she said. "Welcome to Redemption Springs." Wade's eyebrows rose slightly at the quality of the liquor. "Generous of you, Mrs. Wells. Not all establishments we visit extend such courtesies." "I find courtesy costs little and yields much," Eleanor responded, her gaze steady. Behind the bar, her left foot shifted slightly, pressing against a specific floorboard that would alert Samuel, her faithful barkeeper currently in the storeroom, that something was amiss. Wade took a slow sip of his whiskey, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. "Indeed, though I've found that true generosity requires deeper commitment." He set his glass down with deliberate precision. "Which brings me to the purpose of our visit. My employer, Mr. Ezekiel Bishop, has taken an interest in Redemption Springs. He believes this town has untapped potential." Several patrons quietly settled their tabs and departed, sensing the conversation had taken a turn toward business they wanted no part of. Eleanor nodded almost imperceptibly to Caleb, who understood her silent message to leave as well. The old prospector hesitated, but eventually gathered his hat and made his way to the door. "Redemption Springs is a simple mining town, Mr. Wade," Eleanor said once most of the civilians had cleared out. "Our potential seems fairly well tapped already," Wade chuckled, the sound devoid of genuine humor. "That's where vision comes in, Mrs. Wells. Mr. Bishop possesses remarkable vision. He sees opportunities where others see limitations." He gestured expansively. "This saloon, for instance, prime location, solid business, but it could be so much more under the right management." Eleanor's expression remained impassive, though her mind had already accelerated into the rapid tactical assessment that had once been her professional hallmark. 3 visible threats. Potential reinforcements. Outside. Distance to the shotgun concealed beneath the bar, approximately 18 inches. Distance to the rifle mounted beneath the staircase, 12 feet. The Colt at her fingertips, loaded with 6 rounds, recently cleaned and oiled, as it was every evening before closing. "The Silver Spur isn't for sale, Mr. Wade," she stated flatly. The younger man shifted his weight aggressively, but Wade raised a hand to still him. "Now, Mrs. Wells, no one's speaking of sales just yet. Think of this as a partnership opportunity. Mr. Bishop provides protection, manages certain aspects of the business that a widow might find challenging, and in return takes a reasonable percentage of the profits. 50% being the reasonable figure Mr. Bishop has in mind, Cooper added, speaking for the first time, his voice carrying a distinctive Texas drawl. Eleanor allowed a moment of silence before responding, using the time to pour herself a small glass of whiskey. Mr. Wade, I've managed this establishment successfully since my husband's passing. I have no need for protection nor for partners. She took a deliberate sip. Please convey my appreciation to Mr. Bishop for his interest, but I must decline. Wade's facade of civility slipped momentarily, a flash of anger crossing his features, before he mastered it. Mrs. Wells, I don't think you understand the nature of Mr. Bishop's offer. It's not one that people typically decline. I understand perfectly, Mr. Wade, Eleanor replied, her voice cooling by several degrees, and my answer remains the same. The batwing doors swung open again, and Samuel entered, his imposing frame filling the doorway. At 6'4", with shoulders like an ox, the former blacksmith cut an intimidating figure. His dark eyes quickly assessed the situation before he moved behind the bar to stand beside Eleanor. "Everything all right, Mrs. Wells?" he asked, his deep voice rumbling through the tension-filled room. "Just fine, Samuel," Eleanor replied without taking her eyes off Wade. "Our guests were just leaving." Wade's gaze flicked between Eleanor and Samuel, reassessing the situation. After a moment he smiled thinly and finished his whiskey in one swallow. "Very well, Mrs. Wells. We won't take up more of your valuable time today." He placed his hat back on his head with deliberate slowness. "But I should mention that Mr. Bishop is a persistent man. He doesn't take rejection well." "Neither do I, Mr. Wade," Eleanor replied evenly. Wade tipped his hat slightly. "We'll be in town for a few days. Perhaps you'll reconsider once you've had time to reflect on the benefits of Mr. Bishop's protection. Terrible things can happen to businesses in these lawless territories. Fires, vandalism, accidents." Eleanor's gaze hardened. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Wade?" "Merely stating facts, ma'am. The world is full of dangers." He gestured to his companions, and they moved toward the door. At the threshold, Wade turned back. "Oh, one more thing. Sheriff Miller sends his regards. Says he's mighty sorry he couldn't be here to welcome us personally, what with his sudden trip to visit his ailing mother in Denver. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." The implications were clear. The town's law enforcement had been deliberately removed from the equation. After the door swung shut behind them, Samuel turned to Eleanor, concern etched on his face. "Those were Bishop's men, weren't they? I've heard stories about what happens to towns that fall under their influence." Eleanor watched through the window as the three men mounted their horses. Her right hand still rested near the concealed Colt, though she hadn't needed to draw it yet. "Yes," she confirmed, "and they'll be back." "What do we do?" Samuel asked. Eleanor's mind was already racing through scenarios, evaluating options with the analytical precision that had once made her the most sought-after shooting instructor in the Western Territories before she'd met Robert and chosen a different life. "For now, we prepare," she said quietly. "Have Thomas watch the back entrance. Send a word to Daniel at the telegraph office. I need to send a message." She paused, making a decision. "And bring down the case from my office, the locked one." Samuel's eyes widened slightly. In 7 years, he'd never seen Eleanor open that particular case. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, disappearing up the stairs to her private quarters above the saloon. Eleanor turned back to the window, watching Wade and his men as they rode toward the town's only hotel. She knew their type all too well, men who mistook violence for strength, intimidation for respect. The Bishop brothers' gang had been systematically taking over small towns across the territory, establishing networks of businesses through which they laundered money from their more illegal enterprises. Protection rackets, cattle rustling, stagecoach, robberies, and worse. They saw a widow running a successful saloon alone and assumed vulnerability. A common mistake, and one Eleanor had encountered frequently throughout her former career. What Wade couldn't know was that before she was Eleanor Wells, respectable widow and proprietor of the Silver Spur Saloon, she had been known by another, a name in certain circles, Eleanor Quicksilver Blackwood, the woman who had outshot Annie Oakley at 3 exhibition matches, who had trained Army Scouts in marksmanship, who could put 6 bullets through the same hole at 50 paces. The woman who had once been the most celebrated sharpshooter west of the Mississippi before she disappeared from public life to marry a simple saloon owner and start anew. Samuel returned, carrying a long, narrow case of polished cherrywood, secured with brass fittings and a heavy lock. He placed it carefully on the bar before her. "Will there be trouble, Mrs. Wells?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Eleanor's fingers traced the inlaid pattern on the case's lid, a rising phoenix crafted from silver and copper. "Yes, Samuel, I believe there will be." She removed a small key from the chain she wore around her neck, the only piece of jewelry she permitted herself besides her wedding band. The lock opened with a soft click, and Eleanor raised the lid to reveal the custom Winchester rifle nestled in red velvet lining. The weapon was a work of art, its walnut stock inlaid with silver wire in an intricate pattern of feathers, the blued steel barrel maintained in perfect condition despite years of disuse. Beside it lay a gun belt, holding a matched pair of Colt revolvers with pearl grips, each one customized to her exact specifications. "I had hoped never to need these again," she said softly, more to herself than to Samuel. Her fingertips brushed the cool metal of the rifle, and memories flooded back. The roar of the crowd as she shot playing cards from the air, the smell of gunpowder, the perfect stillness that came over her when lining up an impossible shot. For 7 years, Eleanor Wells had kept Quicksilver. Blackwood locked away, buried alongside the husband she'd loved. But as she felt the familiar weight of the Winchester in her hands once more, she knew that part of her had never truly disappeared. The Bishop gang had made a critical error in targeting her saloon. They saw a vulnerable widow where they should have seen a predator lying in wait. "Send word to Judge Parker in Fort Smith," Eleanor instructed Samuel, her voice taking on a tone of quiet authority that he'd never heard from her before. "Tell him Quicksilver sends her regards and requests information on the Bishop brothers' operation." Samuel's expression shifted from concern to surprise as recognition dawned. "Quicksilver? You're the Quicksilver Blackwood, the one they wrote about in those dime novels?" Eleanor's lips curved in a humorless smile as she sighted along the Winchesters, barrel muscle memory returning instantly. "The novels are exaggerated. Reality was more precise." She lowered the rifle. "The Bishop gang doesn't know what they're walking into, Samuel. But they will." As the evening shadows lengthened across Redemption Springs, Eleanor began checking over her firearms with methodical care, her movements displaying a level of expertise that revealed her true nature. The Bishop gang had come hunting what they thought was easy prey, never suspecting they had instead roused a legendary predator from her self-imposed retirement. By morning, word would spread that the notorious Bishop gang was in town. By nightfall, they would learn what it meant to threaten Eleanor Wells and the home she had built. The legendary Quicksilver was about to emerge from the shadows once more, and Redemption Springs would never be the same again. The first light of dawn had barely begun to paint the eastern sky when Eleanor Wells climbed to the roof of the Silver Spur In the grey half-light, she moved with a fluid grace that would have surprised her regular patrons. Gone was the careful, measured movement of a respectable saloon proprietor, replaced by the silent prowl of a hunter assessing terrain. From this vantage point, she had an unobstructed view of Redemption Springs' main street, the hotel where Wade and his men had taken rooms, and the key approaches to her establishment. Eleanor settled into a shadowed corner of the roof, her Winchester, cradled comfortably in arms that remembered its weight perfectly, despite the years of separation. As she surveyed the sleeping town, her mind calculated ranges, angles, and potential scenarios with the mechanical precision that had once been part of her daily routine. The hotel, 176 yards, factoring in the slight elevation. The stable, 83 yards with a clear line of sight to the entrance. The sheriff's office, now conspicuously empty, 121 yards, partially obscured by the barbershop's awning. Her practiced eye noted defensible positions, potential cover, sight lines that could be exploited or defended against. Redemption Springs had been her home for 7 years, but she'd never before viewed it as a tactical environment. Now, the familiar streets transformed in her vision to a complex web of ranges, angles, and positions. A battlefield waiting to happen, Mrs. Wells. Samuel's voice came softly from the access ladder. Coffee's ready. Eleanor nodded without turning. Thank you, Samuel. The big man climbed onto the roof, carefully balancing 2 steaming cups. He handed one to Eleanor before settling his substantial frame next to her. Didn't know you were one for rooftop contemplation. Old habits, she replied, taking a sip of the strong black coffee. There's a certain clarity that comes with elevation. Samuel studied her profile in the growing light. The woman beside him seemed subtly different from the employer he'd known for years. Her posture, her alertness, the way her eyes continuously scanned their surroundings. Judge Parker's telegram arrived while you were up here, he said, passing her a folded yellow paper. Came through on the early wire. Daniel brought it straight over. Eleanor unfolded the telegram and read the brief message. Quicksilver, stop. Bishop Brothers, expanding operations, stop 3 towns already under control. Stop federal marshals stretched thin. Stop your actions, have official blessing. Stop, be careful. Old friend, stop Parker. She refolded the paper and tucked it into her pocket. Judge Isaac Parker, known throughout the territories as the hanging judge, had been one of the few officials who knew of her past work with various law enforcement agencies. His official blessing meant she had latitude to act, though not explicit government backing. Also, I've been asking around town, Samuel continued. The Bishop gang, they've been systematically taking over small settlements across the territory. They follow the same pattern. Identify key businesses, apply pressure until owners sell, then use those establishments to control the town and launder money from their other operations. And anyone who resists, Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer. Samuel's expression darkened. Accidents happen, fires, beatings, folks disappearing. By the time they're done, they own enough of the town that no one dares speak against them. Eleanor nodded, having seen similar operations during her former career. They're more organized than the typical gang. That suggests a military background, or at least someone with tactical experience calling the shots. She raised her Winchester, using the scope to study the hotel more carefully as the morning light strengthened. 3 more riders had arrived sometime during the night, reinforcements, no doubt. The gang was establishing a presence, preparing to apply more pressure. Samuel, I need you to tell me everything you know about Wade and the Bishop brothers, every detail, no matter how small. The big man shifted, his expression troubled. Been asking around since yesterday. Ezekiel Bishop, he's the brains. Rarely. Seen in person. Former Union Army officer, discharged under questionable circumstances. His brother Malachi handles the violent side of things. They say he killed 16 men during the border wars and developed a taste for it. And Wade? Eleanor? Prompted, Jackson Wade served under Ezekiel during the war. Now he's their advance man. He identifies targets, applies initial pressure, calls in the muscle when needed. Samuel hesitated. There's something else. The young one with Wade, they call him Rattler, has a reputation for using a knife, likes to take trophies. Eleanor's expression remained impassive, but her grip on the Winchester tightened slightly. How many men total? From what I've gathered, they travel with anywhere from 10 to 20. Word is, they've got at least a dozen currently at a camp outside town, planning to move in gradually so as not to alarm the citizenry. Eleanor lowered her rifle, her mind processing this information. A dozen men is significant manpower for a town this size, especially with the sheriff conveniently absent. Samuel's face showed his concern. Mrs. Wells, Eleanor, I know you have some history with a gun, but these are professional killers we're talking about. Maybe we should consider their offer, just until the Marshal Service can send help. Eleanor turned to face him fully, and Samuel almost recoiled at the transformation in her eyes. Gone was the composed widow he'd known for years, replaced by something harder, sharper, the gaze of a predator assessing prey. Samuel, she said quietly, there's something you need to understand. Before I was Eleanor Wells, I was known by another name in certain circles. The skills I possessed weren't just for show performances. I worked with the Pinkerton Agency, the Army, and territorial marshals to track and eliminate threats that conventional law enforcement couldn't handle. Samuel stared at her, pieces falling into place. The newspapers said Quicksilver Blackwood, retired to marry some saloon owner. His eyes widened. That was you, and Robert. Eleanor nodded, a flash of old pain crossing her features at the mention of her late husband. Robert knew who I was, what I'd done. He offered me a different life, one where I didn't have to live by the gun. Her expression softened momentarily. We had 3 beautiful years before tuberculosis took him. She turned her attention back to the town below, where people were beginning to stir as the new day progressed. I've kept my promise to him for 4 years, lived quietly, ran the saloon, been Eleanor Wells the widow instead of Quicksilver Blackwood the shooter. But I won't let these men destroy what Robert and I built together. What's your plan? Samuel asked, a new respect evident in his voice. Eleanor's lips curved in a small, cold smile that never reached her eyes. First, we gather intelligence. Know your enemy better than they know themselves. That's the foundation of any successful operation. She rose fluidly, slinging the Winchester across her back with practiced ease. The Bishop gang believes they're targeting a defenseless widow. That misconception gives us an advantage I intend to exploit. As they descended from the roof, Eleanor outlined her immediate priorities, gathering information on the gang's movements, assessing their strengths and weaknesses, identifying potential allies within the town, and preparing the silver spur for the inevitable confrontation. What about evacuation? Samuel asked as they reached the ground floor. Some of the townsfolk might want to leave before things escalate. Eleanor considered this. Arrange transport for any who wish to go, especially families with children. But do it quietly. We don't want to alert Wade that the town is preparing for trouble. She moved to the bar and laid out a map of Redemption Springs that she'd marked with tactical notations during the night. They'll establish observation points here, here, and likely here. She indicated several locations that offered good views of the main street. Their main force will remain outside town until Wade signals they're needed. Samuel studied the map with newfound appreciation for Eleanor's tactical thinking. You've done this before. Many times, she confirmed without elaboration. The front door opened, admitting Thomas Harding, the young man who helped tend bar during busy evenings. His normally cheerful face was tight with concern. Mrs. Wells, there's trouble at Martha's cafe, he reported. Wade and his men are there making a scene. Eleanor's expression hardened. What kind of scene, Thomas? Breaking dishes, threatening customers, saying something about how businesses in Redemption Springs need to understand the new order of things. Eleanor moved to the glass case mounted on the wall behind the bar, the one that patrons assumed held an ordinary shotgun for dealing with rowdy customers. She unlocked it and removed not the expected scattergun, but a streamlined Henry rifle, custom-modified with a special sight of her own design. "Samuel, mind the saloon," she instructed. "Thomas, find Daniel at the telegraph office. Tell him to send word to Fort Collins. Request an update on Marshal Dawson's whereabouts." As Eleanor checked Henry's action and loaded it with practiced efficiency, Samuel placed a cautioning hand on her arm. "You're not planning to take on all three of them at once." Eleanor slid the rifle into a special holster concealed beneath. Her long coat, a garment that had always seemed oddly formal for a saloon proprietor, but now revealed its practical purpose in concealing weapons. "No, Samuel," she replied, her voice taking on the cool precision that had been Quicksilver's trademark. "I'm not going to engage them directly, not yet, but Martha Hopkins has been good to me since I arrived in this town. I won't let her business be destroyed while I hide behind these walls." She adjusted her coat and headed for the door, but Samuel's voice stopped her. "Eleanor," he said, concerned evidently, "if you show your hand too soon—" She turned back, her grey eyes now holding the focused intensity of a master at her craft. "I know exactly how much of my hand to show, Samuel. Wade wants to demonstrate his power to the town. I'm simply going to introduce a variable he hasn't accounted for." Martha's cafe occupied a simple clapboard building 2 doors down from the Silver Spur. By the time Eleanor approached, a small crowd had gathered outside, their faces showing the mixture of fear and helpless anger typical of citizens confronted. With violence they felt powerless to stop. Through the cafe's windows, Eleanor could see overturned tables and broken dishes. Wade stood in the center of the destruction, one hand resting casually on his holstered revolver, while Cooper systematically smashed plates from behind the counter. Martha herself was pressed against the wall, her face pale with fear as the young one, Rattler, twirled a knife near her face with deliberate menace. Eleanor didn't hurry as she approached the cafe's entrance. Her movements remained measured, unhurried, her right hand hanging naturally near where the Henry rifle rested against her hip beneath her coat. She catalogued details with professional detachment: Wade's position relative to the door, the distance to Rattler, the fact that Cooper's gun was still holstered as he focused on property destruction. The bell above the door chimed softly as she entered, drawing all eyes toward her. "Gentlemen," she greeted them, her voice carrying the same calm authority she used to quell bar fights in the Silver Spur, "I believe you've made your point. Now, I suggest you leave Mrs. Hopkins's establishment before this situation deteriorates further." Wade's scarred face split in a mocking smile. "Mrs. Wells, coming to your neighbor's rescue? How heroic." He gestured around at the destruction. "We were just explaining to Mrs. Hopkins here the dangers of operating a business without proper protection." Eleanor's gaze went to Martha, noting the thin line of blood on the older woman's cheek where Rattler's knife had grazed her. Something cold and deadly shifted behind Eleanor's eyes. "Step away from her," Eleanor said to Rattler, her voice dropping to a register that made the young outlaw blink in surprise. "Or what, lady?" he sneered, though something in her tone had caused him to take a half-step back. "You gonna serve me a drink?" In one fluid motion, so fast that later witnesses would argue about exactly what they'd seen, Eleanor's coat swept aside and the Henry rifle appeared in her hands. She didn't point it at anyone, merely held it with the practiced ease of someone intimately familiar with firearms. "My first suggestion was polite," she said, her voice now carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "This one isn't. Step away from Martha, put the knife away and leave. Now." A tense silence filled the cafe. Wade studied Eleanor with new interest, his eyes taking in her stance, The way she held the rifle, the absolute stillness that had come over her. The stillness of a predator prepared to strike. "Well now," he said slowly, "seems the widow has teeth after all." He made a small gesture, and Rattler reluctantly stepped away from Martha, though his face showed he wasn't happy about the retreat. "Just having a friendly business discussion," Wade continued, his tone conversational, though his eyes had taken on a calculating gleam. No need for firearms to enter the conversation. Yet Eleanor remained perfectly still. Henry held not quite pointed at the floor, but not quite aimed at the men either. A professional's ready position that required minimal movement to bring the weapon to bear. "Your business in this town is concluded, Mr. Wade," she stated flatly. "I suggest you and your associates depart Redemption Springs by nightfall." Wade laughed, though it didn't reach his eyes. Bold words from a woman alone. "She ain't alone," came a gravelly voice from the doorway. Eleanor didn't need to look to recognize Caleb Hopkins, Martha's brother, the old prospector now standing, with what was probably an ancient but serviceable shotgun in his gnarled hands. More townspeople had appeared behind him, their initial fear giving way to a simmering anger at the destruction visited upon a beloved local establishment. Wade assessed the shifting situation with the practiced eye of a tactician. The confrontation had escalated beyond his initial plans. His gaze returned to Eleanor, a new respect mingled with suspicion in his expression. "We'll take our leave, Mrs. Wells," he said after a moment. "But don't misunderstand. This conversation isn't over. It's merely postponed." He nodded to his companions. "Gentlemen, let's not overstay our welcome." As they moved toward the door, Wade paused beside Eleanor. In a voice pitched for her ears alone, he murmured, "You're not what you appear to be. Are you, Mrs. Wells? I find myself very curious about what else you might be hiding." Eleanor didn't respond, didn't change her position or expression. Only after the three men had departed and mounted their horses did she lower the Henry rifle, though she kept it in hand rather than concealing it again. Martha Hopkins sagged against the wall in relief, her brother hurrying to her side. The cafe was in shambles, broken dishes, overturned tables, food splattered across the floor and walls. "Thank you, Eleanor," Martha said, her voice shaking. "I thought when that young one pulled his knife." Eleanor moved to her friend's side, checking the shallow cut on her cheek. "It's going to be all right, Martha. But I need you and Caleb to listen carefully now." She looked around at the other townspeople who had entered the cafe, her voice taking on a tone of quiet authority that few of them had heard from her before. "The Bishop gang isn't leaving. What happened here today was just the beginning. A demonstration to frighten you, to make you believe resistance is futile." She set Henry down and began helping Martha to a chair. "They've done this in other towns. They start with intimidation, move to violence, and end by owning everything. Worth having. What can we do?" someone asked from the crowd. "Sheriff Miller's conveniently out of town, and there's no telegraph to the marshal's office that won't be intercepted." Eleanor straightened, and something in her posture caused the murmuring crowd to fall silent. For just a moment they glimpsed someone other than the reserved widow who had run the Silver Spur for the past 7 years. Someone with steel in her spine and ice in her veins. "You do what needs doing," she said simply. "Protect your own, help your neighbors, and prepare for trouble. As for Wade and his men," a cold smile touched her lips, "leave them to me." Caleb Hopkins studied her with newfound respect. "You've handled trouble before, haven't you, Eleanor?" Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Yes, in another life." As she helped the townspeople begin cleaning up Martha's cafe, Eleanor's mind was already racing ahead, planning her next moves. Wade would report back to his superiors, reassess the situation. They'd dig into her background, perhaps discover something of her past, and then they'd return in force, believing that superior numbers would overpower any resistance. They wouldn't make the novice's mistake of underestimating her physical capabilities again. But they would make an even more fundamental error. They would think of her as a conventional opponent, someone who would meet force with force, gun with gun. What they couldn't know was that Quicksilver Blackwood had never been conventional. Her legend hadn't been built on fair fights, but on meticulous planning, superior positioning, and the exploitation of an opponent's weaknesses. While Wade and his men prepared for a frontal assault, she would be establishing the conditions for their complete and systematic destruction. As the sun climbed higher over Redemption Springs, the town buzzed with tension and whispered conversations. Word of the confrontation at Martha's Cafe spread quickly, along with speculation about the Widow Wells and her surprising willingness to stand against the Bishop gang. Eleanor returned to the Silver Spur with the Henry rifle now openly carried. Across her shoulder, a declaration that the time for hiding behind respectability had passed. The message she'd sent was clear to anyone who understood the language of the frontier. A line had been drawn. Now it remained to be seen who would be foolish enough to cross it. Dusk settled over Redemption Springs, painting the mountain backdrop in hues of purple and gold. Eleanor stood at the window of her private quarters above the Silver Spur, watching as lanterns flickered to life along the main street. Behind her, spread across a large oak table, lay maps of the town and surrounding territory, each marked with precise notations in her flowing script. A soft knock at the door preceded Samuel's entrance. The big man carried a tray with coffee and a plate of food that Eleanor knew she should eat, though appetite had become secondary to preparation. Wade and his men returned to the hotel about an hour ago, Samuel reported, setting down the tray. They've got lookouts posted at the livery stable and on the roof of the Mercantile. Eleanor nodded, without surprise. And the reinforcements? 2 more riders came in from the east. That makes 7 in town now, plus whatever force they've got camped outside. Samuel hesitated. There's something else. A fancy carriage arrived. Just before sundown, black with silver trim, curtained windows, went straight to the hotel's private entrance. This drew Eleanor's full attention. Ezekiel Bishop, she said quietly. He doesn't usually involve himself directly until the groundwork is laid. That can't be good. On the contrary, Eleanor replied, moving to the table to make a new notation on her map. It means we've disrupted their standard operation enough that the bishop feels the need to oversee matters personally. A cold smile touched her lips. When a hunter abandons his blind to chase prey directly, he often exposes himself to dangers he didn't anticipate. Samuel studied the complex web of notations on the maps with newfound respect for Eleanor's tactical thinking. Positions were marked, distances noted, sight lines drawn with mathematical precision. You've been busy, he observed. Preparation determines outcome, Eleanor replied simply. She indicated a series of marks along the creek that ran behind the town. This route provides covered access to the rear of the hotel. The Mercantile storeroom offers a clear view of the main street, while remaining concealed from the hotel's front windows. Her finger traced another series of markings, and these positions on the surrounding ridges provide commanding views of every approach to town. Samuel shook his head in wonder. You've mapped the entire area as a tactical environment. I've been doing it since I arrived, Eleanor admitted, surprising him. Old habits. Robert used to tease me about it, said I could turn a church picnic into a military operation. A shadow of grief crossed her features at the mention of her late husband, but it was quickly subsumed by the focused determination that had characterized her since Wade's arrival. Tell me about our resources, she said, changing the subject. Who in town can we count on? Samuel settled his large frame into a chair, gathering his thoughts. After what happened at Martha's Cafe, folks are choosing sides. Most of the shopkeepers are with us. They've seen what happens when gangs like Bishop's take over a town. The miners are split. Some want to fight, others just want to keep their heads down. And weapons. Every household has at least a shotgun or rifle. The mercantile has a decent stock of ammunition, nothing fancy but serviceable. Eleanor nodded, making mental calculations. And who's a genuine shooter? Not just hunting experience, but someone who can handle themselves in a fight? Caleb's steady, despite his age. The Johnson brothers out at the Silver Creek mine? Both. Served in the war. Doc Wallace was a field surgeon and knew how to handle a gun. And there's Abigail Parker. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. The school teacher, Samuel grinned slightly. Her father was a buffalo hunter, taught her to shoot before she could read from what I hear, keeps a Winchester under her bed at the schoolhouse. Good, Eleanor said. We'll need everyone with skills, but we need intelligence first. She touched one of the maps. Bishop's men will be watching the main approaches, but they don't know the terrain like we do. There are ways to move through this valley unseen, if you know how. She moved to a trunk at the foot of her bed and removed a package wrapped in oilcloth. Unwrapping it revealed clothing Eleanor hadn't worn in years. Practical riding attire in dark colors, a far cry from the respectable dresses she'd adopted as a saloon proprietor. I need you to gather our allies quietly, she instructed Samuel. No obvious meetings that would alert Bishop's watchers. Use Martha's Cafe as a neutral. Location, people coming and going there won't raise suspicion. Samuel nodded. And what will you be doing? Eleanor removed her pearl-handled Colts from their case, checking each one with practiced precision before securing them in specialized holsters. Reconnaissance. I need to locate their main camp, assess their numbers and resources. Alone? Samuel asked, concern evident in his voice. I move better alone, Eleanor replied, the statement carrying the weight of years of experience. Always have. As Samuel departed to carry out his part of the plan, Eleanor changed into the dark clothing, the familiar feel of the material bringing back memories of night operations conducted years ago. She braided her hair tightly to keep it secure, applied a light coating of lampblack to her face to reduce reflection, and assembled a small kit of essential tools. The transformation was stark. Gone was Eleanor Wells, respectable widow and businesswoman. In her place stood Quicksilver Blackwood, a ghost from the past who moved like a shadow and saw the night as an ally rather than an obstacle. Eleanor slipped out through a concealed exit she'd built into the saloon structure years ago, another old habit that now proved prescient. The narrow passage led to an alley behind the building, allowing her to depart unseen by the watchers posted along the main street. The night embraced her like an old friend as she moved silently through the town's shadows. Eleanor avoided the open streets, instead using a network of alleys, backyards and drainage ditches that she'd mapped meticulously over the years. Her movements were fluid, economical, betraying years of experience in clandestine operations. At the town's edge, she paused to study the surrounding darkness. The valley that cradled Redemption Springs was framed by rugged foothills that rose to towering peaks beyond. Eleanor knew every trail, every ravine, every vantage point within a 5-mile radius, knowledge that gave her an immense advantage over the newcomers. A soft wicker came from the shadows of a small copse of trees where she'd arranged for a horse to be waiting, not her usual mare, which might be recognized, but a swift black gelding borrowed from the Silver Creek mine. Eleanor checked the animal's tack, ensuring nothing would creak or reflect light, before mounting in a smooth motion and guiding the horse away from town. Rather than taking the main trail, she followed a barely discernible deer path that wound through the brush, using the thick stands of pine and aspen for cover as she climbed to higher ground. From the ridgeline, Eleanor had a commanding view of the valley, with Redemption Springs nestled at its heart, lights twinkling in the darkness. Through Her specialized field glasses, another relic of her former life, she studied the terrain methodically, sector by sector. The hotel was clearly visible, light spilling from several windows despite the late hour. The livery stable, the mercantile, the scattered homes and businesses, all appeared peaceful, but Eleanor knew appearances were deceiving. Her patience was rewarded when she detected movement on the eastern edge of town, a rider moving at a deliberate pace, taking a trail that led toward the foothills. A messenger, perhaps, or a scout. Either way, he might lead her to Bishop's main camp. Eleanor tracked the rider's progress, noting how he avoided the main trail in favor of less obvious routes, another indication that Bishop's men were professionals, not common bandits. When the rider disappeared into a draw about 2 miles from town, Eleanor marked the location in her mental map before urging her mount forward. She followed at a distance, using terrain for concealment, her senses heightened, as they had been in her days tracking targets for the Pinkerton agency. The night air carried sounds clearly in the high mountain valley, the distant call of an owl, the soft creak of leather as the rider ahead adjusted in his saddle, the subtle shift of pine needles under her own horse's hooves. The trail led deeper, into the foothills, eventually opening into a sheltered box canyon that would be nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Eleanor dismounted before reaching the canyon's mouth, securing her horse in a dense stand of trees before proceeding on foot. Moving with the silent precision that had made her legendary among lawmen and outlaws alike, she crept to a vantage point overlooking the canyon. What she saw confirmed her suspicions. A well-organized camp with sentries posted at strategic points. Not the haphazard collection of tents typical of most outlaw gangs, but a disciplined operation that bespoke military background. Eleanor counted tents, estimated numbers, noted the placement of horses and equipment. She marked the sentries' positions and patrol patterns, evaluated approaches and potential vulnerabilities. Every detail was filed away with professional thoroughness. Most telling was the large tent at the canyon center, illuminated from within, where shadows moved in what appeared to be a meeting in progress. Eleanor adjusted her position, seeking a better angle to observe the central tent, freezing instantly when a twig snapped somewhere to her right. A sentry, moving on a patrol route she hadn't yet mapped. Eleanor went perfectly still, controlling her breathing as the guard passed within 10 feet of her position. Had this been a regular outlaw, his careless movements and limited awareness would have made him easy to avoid. But this man moved with purpose, his eyes constantly scanning, rifle held ready. Another indication that Bishop's operation was several cuts above the typical gang. Once the sentry moved on, Eleanor resumed her observation of the central tent. A figure emerged briefly, tall, distinguished even at this distance, with a military bearing that marked him as someone accustomed to command. Ezekiel Bishop himself, judging by Samuel's description. Eleanor studied him with cold detachment, noting details that could prove useful later. His height, the way he moved, the difference shown to him by the men around him. Knowledge was power, and in her experience, knowing your enemy was the first step toward defeating them. Having gathered the intelligence she came for, Eleanor withdrew as silently as she had arrived, retrieving her horse and taking a circuitous route back toward town. The information she'd gathered painted a concerning picture. Bishop had brought a force of at least 20 men, all apparently well-trained and equipped. Combined with the 7 already in town, they represented a significant threat to Redemption Springs. But numbers alone didn't determine outcomes. Eleanor had faced worse odds during her career as Quicksilver and prevailed through superior preparation and tactical advantage. The disciplined nature of Bishop's operation was concerning, but also created potential vulnerabilities. Military thinking was often predictable to those who understood its patterns. Dawn was breaking as Eleanor returned to the Silver Spur, using her concealed entrance to slip back inside undetected. Samuel was waiting in her private office, his face showing relief at her safe return. "Thought you might want to know," he said without preamble. "Wade's been asking questions around town. About you, specifically." Eleanor nodded as she removed her field equipment. "Expected. What kind of questions? Where you came from? How long have you been here? Whether anyone knew you before you married Robert?" Samuel hesitated. "And he's offering good money for information about a female sharpshooter who used to perform in Wild West shows." A cold smile touched Eleanor's lips. "He's connecting the dots. Good. Let him chase shadows while we prepare." She moved to her maps, making new notations based on what she'd observed. "Bishop's main force is here." She indicated the box canyon. "Approximately 20 men, well-armed and disciplined. They've established a professional operation with proper sentry positions and patrol routes." Samuel whistled softly. 20 men plus the 7 in town. Those are long odds, Eleanor." I've faced worse," she replied without looking up from her maps, "and they have weaknesses. Their camp is well positioned against a frontal assault, but vulnerable to observation from the ridgeline above. They've posted sentries, but their patrol patterns are regular, predictable, and most importantly, they're operating in unfamiliar territory against an opponent they don't fully understand. They'll figure out who you are eventually," Samuel pointed out. Eleanor's expression hardened. "By then, it will be too late." She outlined what she'd seen, describing the camp's layout, the sentries' positions, and her observations of Bishop himself. As she spoke, a plan began to take shape. Not a direct confrontation, which would be suicide against superior numbers, but a series of calculated moves designed to destabilize Bishop's operation, create confusion, and ultimately force him into errors that could be exploited. "What about the townspeople?" Samuel asked. "Bishop's men could take hostages, use them as leverage." Eleanor nodded, having considered this. "Those who can leave should do so, quietly, a few at a time so as not to alert Bishop's watchers. Those who stay need to be prepared to defend themselves and follow instructions precisely." She paused, meeting Samuel's gaze directly. "This won't be clean, Samuel. People could get hurt despite our best efforts." The big man nodded solemnly. "Folks understand the stakes. After what happened to Watson's Ford, when the Bishop gang took over, people here would rather fight than surrender." Watson's Ford, a small settlement 2 counties over that had fallen to Bishop's operation the previous year. Rumors spoke of businesses seized, citizens intimidated, and those who resisted dealt with harshly. The once thriving town was now effectively an outlaw stronghold, its legitimate commerce replaced by gambling, prostitution, and way stations for stolen cattle. "We won't let that happen here," Eleanor stated, the quiet certainty in her voice making it sound like an immutable fact rather than a mere intention. She turned back to her maps, calculating distances, angles, and timing with the same meticulous precision she'd once applied to impossible shots. "Samuel, I need you to gather specific supplies," she said, listing items that seemed eclectic but held clear purpose to her tactical mind. As Samuel departed to fulfill her requests, Eleanor moved to the chest containing her specialized equipment. Beyond the matched Colts and the Winchester that had been her performance pieces, the chest held tools of a different sort. Items she'd used during her less public work for the Pinkertons and territorial marshals. She selected several devices and set them aside, each one representing a capability that Bishop's men wouldn't expect. In her experience, surprise was often more valuable than superior firepower, especially when facing larger forces. A knock at her door preceded the arrival of Thomas, the young barkeeper, his expression troubled. "Mrs. Wells, one of Bishop's men, is downstairs. Not Wade or the others from yesterday. Someone new. Says he has a message for you." Eleanor nodded, quickly concealing the maps and equipment before changing into more appropriate attire for a saloon proprietor. She checked her appearance in the mirror, ensuring that nothing of Quicksilver Blackwood showed through the carefully constructed persona of Eleanor Wells. "Show him up," she instructed, positioning herself behind her desk in a posture of casual confidence. The pearl-handled Colt remained within easy reach, concealed beneath a ledger. The man who entered carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Tall, immaculately dressed in a tailored suit rather than frontier attire, with silver threads in his dark beard and calculating intelligence in his deep-set eyes. This was no mere messenger. "Mrs. Wells," he greeted her with a slight bow. "Ezekiel, Bishop at your service. I hope you'll forgive the early hour of my call." Eleanor studied him coolly, noting the fine quality of his clothing, the subtle bulge of a concealed shoulder holster, the way he scanned the room upon entering, assessing threats, exits, tactical positions. Everything about him spoke of his military background. "Mr. Bishop," she acknowledged with a nod, "I believe your associate Mr. Wade already conveyed your business proposition." "My answer remains unchanged." Bishop smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "Actually, Mrs. Wells, I find direct conversation often clarifies matters that subordinates might muddle." He gestured toward a chair. "May I?" "Please," Eleanor replied, maintaining her composed facade while inwardly calculating the threat this man represented. Bishop settled into the chair with elegant ease. "I make it a policy to personally evaluate significant acquisitions. The Silver Spur represents just such an opportunity. Prime location, established clientele, respected management." His gaze sharpened. "Although I must admit my interest has recently expanded beyond mere business considerations." "Oh." Eleanor kept her expression neutral, though she knew precisely where this conversation was heading. "Indeed." Bishop leaned forward slightly. "You see, Mrs. Wells, when one of my men is faced with unexpected resistance, I become curious. And when that resistance comes from a woman who handles firearms with suspicious proficiency," he spread, his hands in a gesture of mock puzzlement. "Well, professional curiosity compels me to investigate." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Many women on the frontier know how to handle firearms, Mr. Bishop. Necessity rather than choice." "Of course," he agreed smoothly, "but few display the particular stance, grip, and situational awareness reported by my men. Characteristics more typical of—" He paused deliberately. "Professional expertise." The room filled with tension as Bishop studied her, looking for any reaction that might confirm his suspicions. Eleanor gave him nothing, maintaining the composed demeanor she'd cultivated since arriving in Redemption Springs. "You've come to deliver a message, Mr. Bishop," she said after a moment. "I'd appreciate it if you'd state it directly." Bishop's smile widened fractionally, a predator's expression. "Very well. Redemption Springs is changing, Mrs. Wells. This quiet backwater is about to become part of something larger, more profitable. Those who recognize this shift and align themselves accordingly will prosper. Those who resist," he shrugged eloquently, "progress has always claimed casualties." "And your point?" "My point, dear lady, is that I'm offering you a final opportunity to be on the right side of this inevitable change." Bishop's voice hardened slightly. "Sell me the Silver Spur for a more than generous price, or watch it burn to the ground. Within the week." Eleanor regarded him silently for a moment, seeing not just the man before her, but the operation he represented. The corrupted towns, the intimidated citizens, the lives destroyed in pursuit of profit and power. "Mr. Bishop," she replied, her voice carrying a new edge that made the man blink in surprise, "let me be equally direct. You and your men will leave Redemption Springs immediately. You will not return. You will not threaten anyone in this town. Again." She leaned forward, the mask of the respectable widow slipping just enough to reveal something harder beneath. "This is not a negotiation or a discussion. It is the only warning you will receive." Bishop stared at her, genuine surprise flickering across his features before being replaced by amused condescension. "My dear Mrs. Wells, I don't think you fully grasp the situation. I have 27 men at my disposal. The sheriff is conveniently absent. The nearest marshal is 2 days' ride away." He spread his hands. "What exactly do you imagine will stop me from taking what I want?" Eleanor's smile was cold and sharp as a midwinter dawn. "Me, Mr. Bishop, I will stop you." The outlaw leader studied her for a long moment before laughing softly. "Remarkable, truly remarkable. I began to suspect the rumors might actually be true." He rose from his chair with fluid grace. "I look forward to discovering exactly who you are, Mrs. Wells, or should I say, Quicksilver." He tipped his hat slightly and turned to leave, pausing at the door. "You have until sundown tomorrow to reconsider my offer. After that—" his expression hardened. "After that, I cannot guarantee the safety of anyone in this town." After Bishop departed, Eleanor remained seated, her mind racing through calculations and contingencies. The confrontation had confirmed what she'd suspected. Bishop was no common outlaw, but a sophisticated operator with military training and significant resources. More concerning, he'd obviously connected enough dots to suspect her true identity. The timeline had accelerated. Bishop wouldn't wait for Wade's usual gradual approach now that his curiosity was piqued. He would move decisively to either confirm his suspicions about her or eliminate the threat she represented. Eleanor rose and moved to the window, watching as Bishop crossed the street to the hotel, flanked by 2 men who materialized from the shadows to escort him. The pieces were moving on the board, the opening gambits exchanged. Now the true game would begin. Mid-morning sunlight streamed through the windows of the Silver Spur as Eleanor methodically cleaned her matched Colts at a corner table. The saloon was closed, officially for inventory, but in reality to provide a secure meeting place away from Bishop's watchful eyes. Samuel stood guard at the front door, while Thomas monitored the rear entrance, both armed and alert for any approach. The batwing doors swung open, admitting Caleb Hopkins, the aging prospector who had stood with Eleanor at Martha's Cafe the previous day. Behind him came 4 others: Doc Wallace, a graying man with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles; the Johnson brothers, Seth and Levi, both broad-shouldered men with the hardened look of those who'd seen combat; and Abigail Parker, the schoolteacher, her practical dress and severe bun belying the determined set of her jaw. "That's everyone who could come without drawing attention," Caleb announced, removing his hat. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of Eleanor's weapons spread across the table. "Well now, that's a professional setup if I ever saw one." Eleanor nodded acknowledgement as she reassembled one of the Colts with practiced efficiency. "Thank you all for coming. I know the risk you're taking." Doc Wallace stepped forward, studying Eleanor with keen assessment. "Caleb says you've got experience dealing with situations like this. Care to elaborate?" Eleanor set the completed Colt aside and met the doctor's gaze steadily. "Before I came to Redemption Springs, I worked with various law enforcement agencies to track and neutralize threats that conventional methods couldn't address. The famous Quicksilver Blackwood," Abigail Parker said quietly, surprising the others. When they turned to her, she shrugged. "I read. Those dime novels may be mostly fiction, but there was a female sharpshooter who worked with the Pinkertons. They said she could shoot the flame off a candle at 100 yards. 200, Eleanor corrected absently, then caught herself with a small smile. Though that particular story was somewhat exaggerated. Seth Johnson let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned, though those stories were just tall tales." Not all of them, Eleanor replied. She gestured to the chairs around the table. Please sit. We have much to discuss and limited time. As they settled around the table, Eleanor outlined what she'd discovered about Bishop's operation. Their numbers, the location of their camp, the military precision of their organization. She didn't soften the reality of what they faced. Bishop has given an ultimatum, she concluded. By sundown tomorrow, he expects me to surrender the Silver Spur. When I refuse, they'll attack, not just my establishment, but likely the entire town to make an example of those who resist. 27. Against 6, Levi Johnson muttered. Those are mighty long odds. 7 if you count young Thomas, Caleb corrected. 8 with Martha. She's a fair shot with a shotgun. Still not enough, Doc Wallace said bluntly. Not against disciplined gunmen. And we can't count on help from outside. Bishop's men control the approaches to town, and the nearest marshal is at least 2 days' ride. Eleanor listened to their assessment without comment, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. When they had finished voicing their concerns, she spread a map of Redemption Springs and the surrounding area on the table. You're right about the odds, she acknowledged, which is why we won't face them directly. Using small objects as markers, she began outlining her strategy, not a frontal defense, but a carefully orchestrated series of actions designed to divide Bishop's forces, create confusion, and ultimately turn their superior numbers from an advantage into a liability. Bishop expects resistance, she explained, but conventional resistance, barricaded buildings, armed townspeople, perhaps a few good shooters in defensive positions. He's prepared for that. What he's not prepared for is a systematic dismantling of his operation from unexpected angles. She indicated the box canyon where Bishop had established his main camp. Their first vulnerability is their belief in their own security. They've positioned sentries, established patrol routes, created what they consider an impregnable base. But they don't know these mountains like we do. Caleb leaned forward, his interest piqued. The old mining tunnels, some of them run right through that ridgeline. Eleanor nodded. Precisely. According to the survey maps in Robert's office, there's an abandoned shaft that emerges less than a quarter-mile from their position. It wouldn't allow a frontal assault, but it does provide access for other purposes. She turned to the Johnson brothers. You both served in the war. Did either of you work with explosives? Seth's eyes lit with understanding. Blasting charges. We could collapse part of the canyon wall, not to harm them directly, but to block their quickest route to town. And create confusion, uncertainty, Eleanor added, the beginning of doubt. She shifted focus to the town itself, explaining how they would use Redemption Springs' layout to their advantage, creating choke points, establishing hidden firing positions, preparing routes for civilians to evacuate safely if fighting came to the streets. Most importantly, she continued, we need to separate Bishop from his forces. A snake is most dangerous with its head attached. Remove Ezekiel Bishop from the equation, and his operation becomes significantly more vulnerable. You're talking about killing him, Doc Wallace stated flatly. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. I'm talking about neutralizing a threat by the most efficient means available. But if there's a way to accomplish that without bloodshed, I'm amenable to alternatives. Abigail Parker, who had remained largely silent during the discussion, suddenly spoke up. There might be a more elegant solution. When all eyes turned to her, she continued with unexpected authority. Bishop's operation relies on intimidation and control, but it also requires legitimacy, the appearance of legitimate business to mask illegal activities. Go on, Eleanor encouraged, intrigued by the schoolteacher's insight. Before I came to Redemption Springs, I worked as a clerk in the Territorial Land Office, Abigail explained. I've maintained certain professional connections. With the right documentation, we could challenge the legal foundation of Bishop's entire operation." "What kind of documentation?" Caleb asked, skeptically. Abigail's smile held surprising steel. "Property deeds, banking records, evidence of fraud and corruption that would bring territorial authorities down on Bishop, regardless of how many local officials he's bribed." Eleanor studied the schoolteacher with new respect. "Do you have access to such materials?" "Not directly, but I know someone who does." Abigail straightened her shoulders. "My brother works for the Territorial Marshal's office in Denver. He's been building a case against the bishop for months, but hasn't had enough evidence to move against him openly." The revelation shifted the energy in the room. Here was something unexpected. A potential ally with resources they hadn't anticipated. "Can you contact him?" Eleanor asked. Abigail nodded. "There's a station master at the Silver Creek Junction who's trustworthy. He can get a message through without Bishop's men knowing." "This changes things," Eleanor mused, her tactical mind already incorporating this new information into her plans. "Legal pressure won't stop Bishop immediately, but it could force him to defend multiple fronts, divide his attention, and give us time to prepare a proper defense," Seth Johnson added. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "Samuel, I need you to escort Miss Parker to Silver Creek Junction, quietly, using the back trails we discussed." "What about the rest of us?" Levi asked. Eleanor turned back to her map, making quick adjustments to her strategy. "We proceed with preparations. The legal approach is promising but uncertain. We need to be ready if the bishop decides to move, before outside help can arrive." She assigned tasks based on each person's skills and knowledge of the area. The Johnson brothers would prepare the mining tunnel operation. Caleb would help identify and prepare defensive positions throughout town. Doc Wallace would establish a field hospital in the church basement and ensure medical supplies were ready. Samuel, after escorting Abigail, would coordinate evacuation, routes for those townsfolk who couldn't or wouldn't fight. "And what will you be doing?" Doc Wallace asked Eleanor directly. "Reconnaissance and preparation," she replied, her tone making it clear there were aspects of her plan she wasn't sharing with the full group. "Bishop suspects who I am, but he doesn't know for certain. That uncertainty is an advantage we need to exploit." As the meeting concluded and her allies departed, leaving at intervals to avoid drawing attention, Eleanor returned to her weapons, completing the maintenance with the methodical precision that had once been as natural as breathing. Her mind, however, was working on problems beyond the mechanical. Samuel remained behind, watching her with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "You didn't tell them everything," he observed once they were alone. "No," Eleanor admitted, sliding the matched Colts into their holsters. "Some aspects of the plan are better kept compartmentalized. If any of them are captured and questioned," she let the implication hang in the air. Samuel nodded grimly, understanding the harsh realities they faced. "There's something else you should know," he said after a moment. "A rider came in from the east while you were meeting, stopped at the hotel, then headed straight back out, moving like he had urgent business." Eleanor processed this information, making adjustments to her mental timeline. "Bishop sending for reinforcements, most likely. Did you recognize the rider?" "No, but he carried himself like a professional. Military bearing, well armed." "How soon could additional forces arrive, assuming they're coming from Bishop's nearest stronghold?" Samuel calculated quickly. "Watson's Ford is 2 days' hard ride, but if they have men stationed closer—" "We need to assume the worst," Eleanor concluded. "Bishop will have reinforcements within 24 hours, which means our timeline has accelerated." She moved to her maps, making new notations based on this information. "The initial phases need to begin today, not tomorrow. Samuel, get word to the Johnsons. They need to move tonight, not wait for morning." As Samuel departed on this mission, Eleanor climbed to the saloon's roof once more, using her field glasses to study the town methodically. Bishop's men had maintained their positions from earlier, 2 at the livery stable, 1 on the roof of the Mercantile, others doubtless inside the hotel with Bishop himself. They were establishing a presence, preparing to exert control over the town when the time came. But they still thought conventionally, still operated under the assumption that the Widow Wells was merely an unusually stubborn obstacle. Perhaps, with some shooting skill, but nothing that posed a serious threat to their operation. That misconception was their greatest vulnerability, and Eleanor intended to exploit it fully. A movement near the hotel caught her attention. Jackson Wade, emerging with 2 men she hadn't seen before, all 3 mounting horses and heading toward the eastern edge of town. Following up on their suspicions about her identity, she surmised Wade would be investigating her background, looking for confirmation that Eleanor Wells and Quicksilver Blackwood were one and the same. Let him search, she thought coldly. By the time he returned with answers, events would already be in motion that would render such knowledge irrelevant. Eleanor descended from the roof and returned to her private quarters, where she unlocked a cabinet that contained items few in Redemption Springs had ever seen. These weren't the performance weapons she'd used in exhibitions, but specialized tools from her other career, the one that hadn't been chronicled in dime novels or newspaper accounts. She selected several devices and packed them efficiently in a saddlebag, along with ammunition, field rations, and basic medical supplies. Then she changed into the dark clothing she'd worn for her night reconnaissance, adding a specially designed vest with multiple pockets for her equipment. Thomas knocked softly at her door. "Mrs. Wells, Mr. Hopkins is back. Says he needs to speak with you urgently like." Eleanor quickly concealed the more unusual items of her equipment before admitting Caleb. The old prospector's expression was grim, his breathing indicating he'd hurried. "Bishop's men are at the schoolhouse," he reported without preamble. 4 of them, including that snake rattler. They're interviewing the older children about you, asking how long you've been here, where you came from. Eleanor's expression hardened. "Are the children in danger?" Not immediate-like. Abigail's there, keeping things calm, but she sent a boy out the back window with a message, said to tell you they're applying pressure to potential sources. Eleanor understood immediately. Bishop was escalating, using the children to gather intelligence while simultaneously demonstrating his reach and willingness to cross lines that most would consider sacrosanct. "Clever," she murmured, though her eyes had taken on a dangerous glint. "He knows I won't risk the children by confronting his men directly. A calculated move to gather information while limiting my response options." Caleb watched her uncertainty. "What do we do? Can't just let them intimidate children." "No," Eleanor agreed, her voice cooling to a temperature that made Caleb step back instinctively. "We can't." She moved to her window, studying the position of the sun. Still early afternoon, hours of daylight remaining. "Bishop expects me to either ignore this provocation or respond directly. He's prepared for both options." "And what are you planning to do?" Caleb asked. Eleanor's smile was brief and cold. "Neither." She gathered her equipment with swift efficiency. "I need you to get a message to Samuel. Tell him the timeline has changed. Operation Nightfall begins now, not after dark." "Nightfall? But that's the mining tunnel operation." "Precisely," Eleanor cut him off. "Bishop needs to be looking in a different direction, create a distraction to the east, and he'll pull men from the schoolhouse to investigate." She checked her weapons one final time. "That will give me the opening I need." To do what? Eleanor's expression was that of a predator sighting prey. To remind Bishop's men that children are off limits in this conflict, permanently. As Caleb hurried away with her message, Eleanor completed her preparations. The situation at the schoolhouse demanded response, but direct confrontation would endanger the children. Instead, she would employ the approach that had made Quicksilver Blackwood legendary: precision intervention from unexpected angles, creating psychological impact disproportionate to the actual force applied. She slipped out through her concealed exit and moved through town using the network of alleys and service passages she'd mapped over the years. Approaching the schoolhouse directly was impossible, with Bishop's men watching the main streets, but there were other ways to reach the small clapboard building that housed Redemption Springs' educational aspirations. The town had been built around an original settlement that was now largely abandoned, older structures falling into disrepair as the community had expanded in more favorable directions. One such structure was the old church, its collapsing bell tower providing a perfect vantage point overlooking the schoolhouse from a direction Bishop's men were unlikely to monitor. Eleanor ascended the rickety structure with practiced care, testing each foothold before committing her weight. The abandoned bell tower had served as one of her private shooting positions over the years, a place to maintain her skills without the knowledge of her neighbors. She knew every weak point, every sound it might make if handled improperly. From the tower's upper platform, she had a clear view of the schoolhouse yard, where several children were being kept outside under the watch of one of Bishop's men, a tall, raw-boned individual with a distinctive red bandana. Inside, through the schoolhouse windows, she could see Rattler and two others questioning children, while Abigail Parker stood rigidly by her desk, her posture conveying outrage barely held in check. Eleanor assembled her specialized rifle, not the exhibition Winchester with its ornate engravings, but a utilitarian weapon designed for practical application at extreme ranges. She adjusted the scope methodically, accounting for distance, wind, and the angle of her position relative to the targets. Through the scope, she could see the scene in the schoolhouse with crystal clarity. Rattler was leaning over a desk where a young girl sat, his posture deliberately intimidating. One of his companions stood by the door, watching the street outside, while the third placed between the rows of desks, occasionally flicking a child's ear when their answers didn't satisfy him. Eleanor's finger rested lightly beside the trigger guard, not on the trigger itself, a professional habit ingrained through years of discipline. She wouldn't fire unless absolutely necessary. Shooting would be a last resort, especially with children present, but there were other ways to communicate. From her position, Eleanor could see what Bishop's men could not: a dust cloud approaching from the eastern ridge, indicating that Samuel and the Johnson brothers had received her message and begun their operation ahead of schedule. Soon, the sound of explosions would draw attention and forces away from the town center. She needed to act in the narrow window that distraction would create. With practiced efficiency, Eleanor adjusted her equipment, preparing not to shoot, but to implement a different sort of intervention. From a specialized pocket in her vest, she removed several small objects and arranged them carefully on the platform beside her. The distant rumble of the first explosion rolled across the valley right on schedule. Through her scope, Eleanor watched as the men in the schoolhouse reacted. The "look out at the door" calling something to Rattler, who straightened and moved to the window. A hurried discussion ensued, culminating in Rattler dispatching his two companions to investigate while he remained with the children and teacher. Perfect. Eleanor had anticipated exactly this response. Bishop's lieutenant would maintain control of the potential hostages while sending subordinates to assess the new threat. But now Rattler was alone, and that created an opportunity. Moving with the fluid grace that had been her trademark, Eleanor descended the bell tower and approached the schoolhouse from behind, using the building's own shadow for concealment. The structure had a rear entrance that led directly to Abigail's small office, separated from the main classroom by a wooden partition. From her vest, Eleanor removed a specialized tool, a thin metal implement designed for manipulating locks. Without sound, in her other career, entering secured locations undetected had been a necessary skill, one she'd perfected through countless operations. The lock yielded to her expertise in seconds. Eleanor slipped inside, finding herself in Abigail's neat office with its shelves of books and carefully organized papers. Through the thin partition, she could hear Rattler's voice, low, threatening, as he continued questioning the children despite his companion's departure. "Your teacher thinks she's protecting you," he was saying, his tone falsely conversational but laced with menace. "But she's actually putting you all in danger by not cooperating. Now, who wants to tell me more about Mrs. Wells and her visitors?" Eleanor removed 2 items from her equipment, a small mirror mounted on an extensible rod and one of her specialized devices. Using the mirror, she carefully examined the classroom from her concealed position, assessing the situation in detail before acting. Rattler stood near Abigail's desk, his back partially to the office door. His hand rested casually on his holstered gun, a deliberate reminder of the threat he represented. The children, ranging from perhaps 8 to 14 years old, sat rigidly at their desks, eyes wide with fear, but faces set in expressions of stubborn defiance that spoke well of Abigail's influence. Abigail herself stood beside her desk, her posture radiating controlled fury. Her eyes constantly scanned the room, assessing her students' safety while looking for any opportunity to act. When her gaze flickered toward the office door and widened almost imperceptibly, Eleanor knew she'd been spotted. With minute gestures, hidden from Rattler's view, Eleanor conveyed her intentions to the schoolteacher. Abigail gave the barest nod of understanding before speaking to divert attention. "Mr. Rattler," she said, her voice professionally calm despite the situation, "these children have told you everything they know, which is very little. Mrs. Wells is a private person who doesn't share her history with students. Is that so?" Rattler turned toward her, his back now fully to the office door. "Funny thing about that. See, my boss is mighty interested in Mrs. Wells's history. I think she might not be who she claims to be." "People come west for fresh starts," Abigail replied evenly. "That's hardly unusual." Rattler laughed, the sound holding no humor. "Fresh starts, that's one way of putting it." He moved closer to Abigail, invading her personal space in a deliberate act of intimidation. "Another way is that people run west to escape their pasts. And Mrs. Wells, well, she's got quite a past to escape if our suspicions are correct." Eleanor chose that moment to act. With silent precision, she eased the office door open just enough to deploy her device, a specialized canister not much larger than a pocket watch. With a practiced flick of her wrist, she rolled it across the classroom floor, its path taking it directly beneath Rattler's feet. The outlaw noticed the movement too late. As he turned toward the unexpected object, it activated with a soft hiss, releasing a cloud of dense smoke that instantly filled the classroom. Children cried out in surprise, but Abigail's voice cut through the confusion with clear command. "Children!" Hands joined. "Line formation, just like our fire drill. Now!" Eleanor moved through the smoke with confident precision, having anticipated exactly how it would fill the room. While Rattler staggered blindly, coughing and cursing, she approached from his blind side. Her strike was surgical, a precise blow to a nerve cluster that dropped the outlaw to his knees, followed by a second hit that rendered him unconscious. As the smoke began to dissipate, drawn out through the open windows, the scene resolved into a remarkable tableau. 20 children in perfect line formation being led out the front door by their unflappable teacher, while the notorious Rattler lay unconscious on the classroom floor, his own bandana now serving as a gag, his hands and feet bound with leather straps from Eleanor's equipment. Eleanor emerged from the thinning smoke, her dark clothing and face covering making her almost spectral in appearance. The few children who glimpsed her through the haze would later describe a shadow that moved like water, swift and unstoppable. Outside, the sounds of multiple explosions continued to roll across the valley, the Johnson brothers creating the impression of a major assault on Bishop's eastern flank. The distraction would buy them precious time, but not much. Soon, Bishop would realize he'd been deceived, that the eastern threat was largely illusory. By then, Eleanor needed to have implemented the next phase of her plan. She approached Abigail, who had returned alone to the classroom after ensuring her students were safely away from the building. "Are you hurt?" Eleanor asked, removing her face covering now that they were alone. Abigail shook her head, her composure remarkable given the circumstances. "No. But they questioned the children for over an hour. Some of the younger ones were terrified." Eleanor's expression hardened as she glanced at Rattler's unconscious form. "He won't threaten children again." "What now?" Abigail asked. "When his men return and find him like this." "They won't," Eleanor replied with cold certainty. "When Bishop's men return, they'll find an empty schoolhouse and no sign of what happened here." She checked the knots binding Rattler once more. "This one is coming with us. The first piece removed from Bishop's board." Abigail's eyes widened slightly. "You're starting it already, the dismantling you spoke of." Eleanor nodded, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. "Bishop escalated by involving children. Now he learns the consequences of crossing that particular line." She gestured toward the rear door. "There's a wagon waiting behind the old church. Can you drive it while I secure our guest?" As they worked to transport the unconscious outlaw, Eleanor maintained constant awareness of their surroundings, alert for any sign that Bishop's men were returning from their wild goose chase to the east. But the distraction held. The Johnson brothers had executed their part of the plan perfectly, creating enough commotion to draw attention without exposing themselves to direct confrontation. Eleanor secured Rattler in the wagon beneath concealing blankets before turning to Abigail. "Take him to the location we discussed this morning. Samuel will meet you there." "And you?" Abigail asked, studying Eleanor with newfound respect and perhaps a touch of wariness. Eleanor checked her weapons with practiced efficiency. "I have preparations to make. Bishop will respond to this forcefully. We need to be ready." As Abigail drove away with their captive, Eleanor melted back into the shadows of Redemption Springs' back alleys. The opening moves had been made. Bishop's operation had been disrupted, subtly but significantly. A key lieutenant removed, children secured from harm, the first seeds of uncertainty planted. Now the true game would begin, with Redemption Springs as the board and its citizens as unwilling pieces. Bishop had resources, manpower, and ruthless determination on his side. But Eleanor had something perhaps more valuable, intimate knowledge of the territory and the element of surprise. By sunset, Bishop would know that his opponent was not merely a stubborn widow with unexpected shooting skills, but something far more dangerous, a professional who understood the art of asymmetrical conflict, who could turn his superior numbers from an advantage into a vulnerability. The legendary Quicksilver was emerging from retirement, one calculated move at a time. Dusk settled over Redemption Springs, painting the weathered buildings in shades of burnt orange and deep purple. Evening should have brought the usual sounds of piano music drifting from the Silver Spur and cheerful chatter from Martha's Cafe. But tonight the town was unnaturally quiet. Word had spread of the confrontation at the schoolhouse, and most citizens had retreated to their homes, doors locked and windows shuttered against the storm they all sensed was coming. Inside the hotel, Ezekiel Bishop stood at the window of his private suite, hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the darkening street below. The military posture hadn't left him in the decade since he'd exchanged his Union Army captain's uniform for more lucrative civilian attire. Behind him, Jackson Wade shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly aware that his employer's current calm was merely the eye of a hurricane. "Let me understand this correctly," Bishop said without turning, his voice carrying the precise diction of his Eastern education. "Rattler, one of our most experienced men, was taken from the schoolhouse without a single witness, while you and Cooper were investigating explosions that apparently harmed no one, destroyed nothing of value, and conveniently drew you away from your assigned position." Wade swallowed hard. "That's the situation, sir. Whoever took him left no trace, no tracks, no witnesses, nothing. It's like he vanished into thin air." Bishop finally turned, his patrician features composed, but his eyes cold with fury. "Things don't vanish, Wade. Men don't disappear without cause or method. What we're facing is someone with specific skills, tactical thinking, operational experience, and intimate knowledge of the terrain." He picked up a telegram from his desk. "This arrived an hour ago from our contacts in Denver. It confirms what I suspected." He handed the yellow paper to Wade, who scanned it quickly, his expression darkening. "Eleanor Wells, widow of Robert Wells, formerly saloon owner in Denver," he read aloud. "Previously known professionally as Eleanor Quicksilver Blackwood, exhibition shooter and special operative for the Pinkerton Detective Agency." He looked up sharply. "Pinkerton?" "Indeed." Bishop moved to a sideboard where a decanter of whiskey awaited. He poured 2 glasses, handing one to Wade. "Our widow isn't merely a talented amateur with unexpected courage. She's a professional, one of the most accomplished manhunters to ever work the territories." Wade took the whiskey gratefully, though his hand trembled slightly. "The stories about Quicksilver, I thought they were mostly exaggerations, dime novel nonsense." "Some were," Bishop admitted, sipping his drink contemplatively. "But beneath the sensationalism lies something more concerning. During the war, I heard rumors of a female operative who specialized in removing high-value targets behind Confederate lines, someone who could infiltrate seemingly secure locations, eliminate objectives, and extract without detection." His eyes narrowed. "The Army never officially acknowledged such operations, of course." "And you think Mrs. Wells is this operative?" Bishop set his glass down with deliberate precision. "I know she is. The question isn't who we're facing, but rather why Quicksilver Blackwood chose to retire to an insignificant mining town, only to emerge from retirement when we arrived." He steepled his fingers thoughtfully. "It suggests preparation, Wade, long-term planning. This isn't a random confrontation. She's been waiting for something like this." Wade shifted uncomfortably. "What do we do?" "With all respect, sir, if half the stories are true, we adapt," Bishop stated flatly. "We're no longer dealing with a simple acquisition of property, but a calculated engagement with a dangerous opponent." He moved to a map of Redemption Springs spread across his desk, studying it with a tactician's eye. "Double the guards at all positions. Send riders to Watson's Ford immediately. I want every available man here by tomorrow noon. And find Cooper. Tell him to take 5 men and search every building on the west side of town. I want to know where Rattler is being held." "And if we find him?" Wade asked. Bishop's smile was cold. "Then we'll have a clearer understanding of exactly what kind of game Mrs. Wells is playing, and more importantly, what her weaknesses might be." As Wade departed to carry out his orders, Bishop returned to the window, studying the silhouette of the Silver Spur against the darkening sky. After years of methodically building his criminal empire across the territory, he'd finally encountered opposition worthy of his full attention. The thought should have concerned him, but instead he felt a strange anticipation, the professional recognition of a worthy adversary. "Quicksilver Blackwood," he murmured to himself. Let's see if your legend matches reality. 3 miles outside, Redemption Springs, in an abandoned line shack nestled against a rocky outcropping, Eleanor Wells methodically checked her equipment by lantern light. The small cabin had been one of her emergency caches since she'd arrived in the area, stocked with supplies, ammunition, and the specialized tools of her former trade. Few knew of its existence, making it a perfect base for the operation now unfolding. Samuel entered, ducking his head beneath the low door frame. "Johnson brothers are in position at the eastern ridge," he reported. "They've set the remaining charges exactly where you specified. Enough to make Bishop think he's facing a coordinated attack from that direction without causing any actual casualties." Eleanor nodded, not looking up from the map she was annotating. "And our guest?" "Secured. In the root cellar, as you instructed. Still unconscious last I checked." Samuel's expression darkened. "Found something interesting when we searched for him. That pouch he wears on his belt contains human teeth. Trophies, I reckon." A cold anger flickered across Eleanor's features, quickly controlled and channeled into the methodical precision that had made her legendary. "I suspected as much. His reputation preceded him." "What's your plan for him?" Samuel asked, his tone suggesting he had his own preferences for dealing with such a man. "Information first," Eleanor replied, her voice detached, professional. "Rattler's been with the Bishop operation since the beginning. He knows their procedures, fallback positions, and security protocols. Once we have what we need—" She left the sentence unfinished, but her meaning was clear. "Miss Parker's back," Samuel continued. "She made contact with her brother's associate at Silver Creek Junction. Says territorial marshals could be here within 3 days if they push hard." 3 days, Eleanor echoed, calculating. "Too long. Bishop will have consolidated his position by then, potentially taken hostages." She made another notation on her map. "We need to maintain pressure. Keep him responding to our actions rather than implementing his own plans." The door opened again, admitting Abigail Parker. The schoolteacher had exchanged her usual modest dress for practical riding clothes, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She carried a leather satchel which she placed on the table before Eleanor. "Land office records," she explained, opening the satchel to reveal official-looking documents. "Every property transaction in the territory for the past 3 years, including those where the Bishop organization used shell companies and proxies." Her voice took on an edge of professional satisfaction. "My brother's been building this case meticulously. The pattern is clear once you know what to look for." Eleanor examined the documents with focused attention, her mind extracting the relevant patterns from the complex web of transactions. "Bishop's operation isn't just a criminal enterprise," she observed. "It's systematic corruption, leveraging illegal activities to acquire legitimate assets, then using those assets to launder proceeds and expand influence." "Exactly," Abigail confirmed. "They've compromised officials in 3 counties, established a network of businesses that appear legitimate but serve as fronts. Redemption Springs is just the latest target in a carefully orchestrated expansion." Samuel leaned over the table, studying the documents with a furrowed brow. "And knowing this helps us? How exactly? Legal proceedings take time we don't have." "Information is leverage," Eleanor replied, selecting several documents and setting them aside. "These property records show that Sheriff Miller's sudden trip to visit his ailing mother coincided with the purchase of a significant property in his name near Denver, a property he couldn't possibly afford on a sheriff's salary." "Blackmail," Abigail suggested. "Evidence," Eleanor corrected. "Properly deployed, it can be more effective than bullets." She studied the remaining documents, extracting specific names and connections. "Bishop's operation relies on the appearance of legitimacy. Strip that away, and you undermine his ability to operate in the open." She turned to a fresh page in her notebook, making quick notes as a plan formed in her mind. Abigail, I need you to return to town. Maintain your normal routine. The schoolteacher concerned about her students, but otherwise uninvolved. If the bishop's men question you about the incident at the schoolhouse, express appropriate fear and confusion. Abigail nodded, understanding. Her role in the deception. And the children? Keep them home for now. Safety takes priority. Eleanor turned to Samuel. I need you to take these documents to Judge Harmon in Silver Springs. He's not in Bishop's pocket, at least not yet. Tell him that federal marshals are already en route with a larger case file. These documents are just preliminary evidence to justify immediate action. Samuel took the papers, securing them inside his vest. That's a 3-hour ride each way, even pushing hard. I won't be back till morning. I know. But we need to create legal pressure simultaneously with our tactical operations. Bishop's accustomed to fighting on one front at a time. We need to force him to defend multiple vectors. Eleanor checked her timepiece. You should leave now, while Bishop's men are focused on searching for Rattler. Use the Western Trail. It's longer, but less likely to be watched. As Samuel prepared to depart, Eleanor moved to a trunk in the corner of the cabin and unlocked it with a key from around her neck. Inside lay specialized equipment not used in her exhibition shooting, but essential to her other career. Tools, designed for infiltration, surveillance, and, if necessary, elimination. Abigail watched with growing understanding as Eleanor selected several devices and secured them in specialized pockets on her vest. You're going back into town, she stated, not a question. Yes, Eleanor confirmed. Bishop's response to losing Rattler will be to tighten security, conduct searches, and attempt to regain control of the situation. That creates both risk and opportunity. She checked her matched Colts with practiced efficiency. While his men are focused on finding their missing colleague, I'll be gathering critical intelligence on their operation. That's incredibly dangerous, Abigail observed, though her tone held respect rather than objection. They'll be on high alert. Eleanor's smile was brief and cold. High alert means predictable patterns, expected approaches, anticipated threats. For someone with my training, that's not an obstacle. It's an advantage. She secured a specialized knife in a concealed sheath at her wrist. Men like Bishop think in terms of frontal assaults, direct confrontation. They rarely look for threats that come from unexpected angles. As Samuel and Abigail prepared to depart on their respective missions, Eleanor reviewed the latest intelligence. From their allies in town, Doc Wallace had established his field hospital in the church basement as planned. The Johnson brothers had positioned themselves to control the eastern approach to town. Caleb Hopkins and several trusted miners had prepared defensive positions at key locations throughout Redemption Springs. The pieces were in place. Now it was time to execute the next phase of her plan, the gathering of specific intelligence that would allow her to exploit the vulnerabilities in Bishop's operation. Night had fully descended when Eleanor approached Redemption Springs from the north, using a dried creek bed for cover. She'd left her horse secured a mile back, proceeding on foot to minimize the chance of detection. Her dark clothing blended with the shadows, making her nearly invisible against the backdrop of rocks and scrub brush. Through her field glasses, she studied the town methodically, noting the positions of Bishop's sentries, 2 at the hotel entrance, 1 patrolling the roof, others stationed at strategic points throughout the settlement. As Bishop had ordered, the security had been doubled, with pairs of men now watching approaches that had previously been monitored by individuals. Eleanor's strategic assessment was confirmed. Bishop was responding exactly as she'd anticipated, consolidating his forces around key positions rather than maintaining the flexible, dispersed presence that would have been more effective against her type of operation. His military training was both his strength and his weakness. She adjusted her course, moving toward a section of town where the buildings stood dark and apparently abandoned, older structures dating from Redemption Springs' earliest days, now largely unused as the settlement had expanded in more favorable directions. These neglected buildings provided perfect concealment for her approach, as Bishop's men were focused on active businesses and residences. Using a rotted fence line for cover, Eleanor approached the rear of Hawkins's old smithy, a structure that had been abandoned when the blacksmith relocated closer to the mines 3 years earlier. The building's stone foundation remained solid, though its wooden upper structure had begun to deteriorate from neglect. More importantly for Eleanor's purposes, the smithy shared a common wall with the newer telegraph office, a connection that dated from when the telegrapher had first arrived in town and temporarily operated from the blacksmith's back room while his proper office was under construction. Though the door between the buildings had been sealed, Eleanor had discovered during one of her systematic explorations of Redemption Springs that the seal was imperfect, leaving a space just large enough for a person to squeeze through if they removed certain strategic boards. Such knowledge of the town's hidden architecture had been another old habit that now proved invaluable. Eleanor slipped into the abandoned smithy through a rear window, moving silently despite the debris littering the floor. The interior was pitch black, but she navigated with confidence, having memorized the layout during previous visits. Reaching the shared wall, she located the concealed passage by touch and carefully removed the loose boards, creating an opening just large enough to accommodate her slender frame. She paused, listening intently for any sound from the telegraph office beyond, before easing herself through the gap. The telegraph office was dark but not unoccupied. Eleanor's trained senses detected the presence of someone sleeping. The steady breathing of a man seated in a chair, head resting on the telegraph desk. One of Bishop's men, no doubt, was assigned to monitor communications. Moving with the silent precision that had been essential in her former career, Eleanor approached the sleeping figure. In the faint moonlight filtering through the window, she recognized Cooper, Wade's associate from their first confrontation at the Silver Spur. His hat had slipped forward over his eyes, and a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the desk explained his current state. Eleanor observed him dispassionately, calculating options. Eliminating him would be simple, but would alert Bishop that someone had infiltrated his operation. Leaving him might allow her to gather more intelligence undetected. The professional in her weighed the tactical advantages of each approach. Decision made, she moved past the sleeping man to the telegraph apparatus. On the desk lay several yellow message forms, communications received and sent over the past 2 days. Eleanor examined each one methodically, committing the contents to memory, with the trained recall that had been part of her operational skill set. The messages confirmed much of what she'd already deduced, but added critical details. Bishop had indeed called for reinforcements from Watson's Ford, with approximately 15 additional men expected to arrive by noon the following day. He'd also sent communications to contacts in Denver, seeking information about Quicksilver Blackwood and her known associates. Most concerning was a message addressed to someone identified only as the Colonel at Fort Laramie, requesting specialty resources to deal with an unexpected tactical situation. The implications were clear. Bishop was calling in significant support, potentially including former military personnel with specialized training. Eleanor replaced the messages exactly as she'd found them, leaving no trace of her examination. She then turned her attention to the office itself, searching for any additional intelligence that might prove useful. In a locked drawer, the lock proving merely a momentary inconvenience to her skills, she discovered what appeared to be Bishop's operational ledger, a coded record of his organization's activities throughout the territory. Though she couldn't decipher the specific code in the limited time available, She noted the structure and key elements for later analysis. Her intelligence. Gathering complete, Eleanor prepared to withdraw. As she moved toward her concealed entrance, Cooper stirred, mumbling something in his sleep before shifting position. Eleanor froze, every sense alert, ready to act if he awakened. After a tense moment, his breathing returned to the deep rhythm of slumber, and she continued her silent withdrawal. Emerging from the abandoned smithy the same way she'd entered, Eleanor paused to scan her surroundings before moving deeper into the shadows. Her next objective was the hotel itself, not to enter, which would be suicide given the current security, but to observe and gather intelligence on Bishop's immediate operations. Using the town's network of alleys and neglected structures, she made her way to a position behind the livery stable. From there, she had a clear view of the hotel's rear entrance while remaining concealed in the stable's deep shadows. For over an hour, Eleanor maintained her surveillance, documenting the movement of Bishop's men with professional detachment. She noted patrol patterns, guard rotations, communication methods, every detail that might provide tactical advantage in the coming confrontation. Her patience was rewarded when a carriage arrived at the hotel's rear entrance shortly after midnight. The vehicle was unmarked but clearly expensive, its black lacquered surface gleaming in the moonlight. The driver remained seated while a hotel employee hurried out to open the passenger door. The man who emerged moved with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority, tall, distinguished, with silver at his temples and an unmistakable military posture. He wasn't Bishop, whom Eleanor had already identified, but someone of similar status within the organization. The colonel, she murmured to herself, connecting this arrival with the telegram she'd discovered. Bishop's reinforcements were arriving, ahead of schedule, which accelerated her own timeline significantly. As the newcomer disappeared into the hotel, Eleanor withdrew from her observation post. She'd gathered critical intelligence, Bishop's operational patterns, communication methods, and most importantly, the arrival of high-level reinforcements. Now she needed to adjust her plans accordingly. Moving with practiced caution, she made her way out of town using the same concealed route by which she'd entered. Only when she was safely beyond the sentries' positions did she increase her pace, heading toward the line shack where the next phase of her operation would begin. Rattler would be awake by now, secured in the root cellar beneath the cabin. It was time to extract whatever intelligence he possessed about Bishop's operation, information that, combined with what she'd already gathered, would allow her to construct a comprehensive picture of what they were facing. Eleanor had never enjoyed interrogation. During her career with the Pinkertons, she'd developed techniques that relied more on psychology than brutality, approaches that often yielded better intelligence. But time was limited, and Rattler was hardly an innocent. The methods she would employ would be determined by his cooperation, or lack thereof. The moon was high when she reached the line shack, casting stark shadows across the rugged landscape. Caleb Hopkins was on watch, his weathered face turning toward her as she approached. "Any trouble in town?" he asked, lowering the shotgun he'd raised at her approach. "Nothing unexpected," Eleanor replied. "Bishop's increased security called in reinforcements. A high-level operative arrived tonight, someone they refer to as the Colonel. Military background by his bearing." Caleb nodded grimly. "Thomas brought word about an hour ago. Bishop's men are conducting house-to-house searches on the east side of town, looking for Rattler. They're being rough about it. Broke Mason's arm when he objected to them searching his daughter's bedroom." Cold anger flickered in Eleanor's eyes, quickly controlled and channeled. "Bishop's getting desperate, making mistakes. Alienating townspeople only strengthens our position." She glanced toward the cabin. Our guest, awake. Not particularly cooperative, but that might change once you talk to him. Caleb's expression suggested he had few qualms about whatever. Methods might be employed with someone of Rattler's reputation. Inside the cabin, Eleanor found Doc Wallace checking supplies in his medical kit. The physician looked up as she entered, his expression grim. "I examined him as you asked," he reported without preamble. "No serious injuries beyond the knock to the head you gave him. He's malnourished, showing signs of long-term alcohol and probably opium use." His professional detachment slipped slightly. "Also found something interesting. He's got a military brand on his shoulder. Dishonorable discharge, Civil War era." Eleanor absorbed this information thoughtfully. Confederate? Union? Surprisingly, the mark indicates he was discharged for extreme brutality against civilians, not something the Union Army did lightly, especially during the war. Doc Wallace closed his medical kit with a decisive snap. "Man's a predator, Eleanor. Whatever information you get from him, he can't be allowed to return to Bishop's operation." "I understand," Eleanor replied, her tone making it clear that Rattler's fate was already determined. She checked her Colts out of habit, though she had no intention of shooting the prisoner. "I'll handle the interrogation alone." Doc Wallace nodded, gathering his belongings. "I'll be at the church if you need me. The Johnson brothers sent word they're ready for the next phase whenever you give the signal." After the doctor departed, Eleanor approached the trap door leading to the root cellar. Caleb had secured it with a heavy iron padlock, which he now unlocked, swinging the door open to reveal a steep set of stairs descending into darkness. "Want me to come with you?" he offered, his hand resting meaningfully on his knife. Eleanor shook her head. "Better if I handle this alone. Keep watch outside. We can't risk Bishop's men finding this location while our guest is still providing information." The root cellar was cool and damp, illuminated only by a single lantern hanging from a ceiling beam. In its flickering light, Rattler sat bound to a sturdy chair, his lean face a mask of defiance despite his compromised position. His eyes widened slightly as Eleanor descended the stairs, recognition dawning. "Well now," he drawled, his voice hoarse but controlled, "if it ain't the Widow Wells herself, or should I call you Quicksilver? That is who you are, ain't it? The famous sharpshooter from all them dime novels?" Eleanor set a second lantern on a rough wooden table, adjusting it to cast better light. "My name isn't important," she replied evenly. "What matters is the information you possess about Ezekiel Bishop's operation." Rattler's laugh held no humor. "Lady, you're wasting your time. Ain't nothing you can do to make me say that Bishop wouldn't do 10 times worse if I betrayed him." "I'm not interested in threats or torture, Mr. Rattler," Eleanor said, pulling up a chair to sit opposite him. "Those methods produce unreliable intelligence. I'm offering something different. Transaction. Transaction?" Suspicion laced his voice. Eleanor nodded, maintaining steady eye contact. "Information in exchange for options. Tell me what I need to know about Bishop's operation, and you'll have choices about what happens next. Refuse, and the choices disappear." "What kind of choices?" Rattler asked, wariness battling with curiosity in his expression. "Depends on the value of your information," Eleanor replied. "Could be a swift end rather than a prolonged one. Could be transportation to the nearest territorial prison, where you'd at least be beyond Bishop's reach. Or it could be the opportunity to disappear, new identity, passage to California, enough money to start fresh." She watched his face carefully, noting the flicker of interest at the last option. "Of course, the value of the arrangement depends entirely on the value of what you provide." For several long moments Rattler studied her, weighing his options with the calculation of a man accustomed to navigating dangerous situations. Finally, he gave a small nod. "Ask your questions," he said, his voice flat. "I ain't promising answers, but I'll hear what you want to know." Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. "Let's start with the Colonel. Who is he? And what's his role in Bishop's operation? The interrogation had begun. By dawn, Eleanor would have the intelligence. She needed to execute the next phase of her plan, the systematic dismantling of Ezekiel Bishop's operation, one carefully calculated piece at a time. Dawn broke over Redemption Springs, painting the surrounding mountains in hues of gold and amber. Unlike most mornings in the quiet mining town, this one brought an unsettling silence. No miners heading to their claims, no merchants opening their shops, no children running to school. The streets remained empty, windows shuttered, doors barred. A town holding its breath before the storm. On the roof of the Silver Spur, Eleanor Wells stood motionless, her Winchester cradled in arms that showed no fatigue despite the sleepless night. Her grey eyes, clear and focused, surveyed the town methodically. Nothing ever changed since her nocturnal reconnaissance. Bishop had transformed Redemption Springs into an armed camp overnight. Men patrolled in pairs, their military precision betraying professional backgrounds. The hotel had become a fortress, with guards at every entrance and snipers positioned on the roof. Barricades had been erected at strategic intersections, controlling movement through the town center. 27 men, Eleanor counted silently. Bishop's original force, plus the reinforcements that had arrived during the night. Among them were at least 8 with formal military training, including the mysterious colonel, whose presence had accelerated Bishop's tactical preparations. Samuel appeared at her side, his normally cheerful face solemn with the weight of the coming confrontation. "Judge Harmon got the documents," he reported quietly. "He dispatched riders to the territorial marshal's office and the governor. Says he'll have arrest warrants for Bishop and his entire organization by nightfall." "Nightfall will be too late," Eleanor replied, her voice carrying the cool precision of Quicksilver Blackwood rather than the measured warmth of the Widow Wells. "Bishop isn't waiting. Look at their preparations. They're planning to move before noon." Samuel followed her gaze to the hotel, where men were loading equipment into wagons, while others established defensive positions. "They're preparing to leave." "After all this?" "Not leave," Eleanor corrected. "Consolidate." Bishop's shifting to his contingency plan. Seize control of key buildings, take hostages if necessary, and establish enough leverage to force the town's capitulation before outside help can arrive. She adjusted her field glasses, studying the hotel's main entrance. The colonel's presence has changed their approach. They're implementing military tactics now, not just criminal intimidation. "What's our move?" Samuel asked, deferring to her. "Expertise without question." Eleanor checked her timepiece. "Johnson Brothers, in position at the eastern ridge, as ordered. They've rigged the remaining charges for remote detonation. Caleb and his miners? Ready at the Silver Creek shaft. They've finished the modifications you specified, and the Bishop's captured men, secured in the church basement under Doc Wallace's supervision, 5 in total, including Rattler, all disarmed and restrained." Eleanor nodded, making final calculations in her mind. During the night, she'd implemented the initial phases of her plan, systematically capturing isolated pairs of Bishop's men during their patrols, creating confusion and uncertainty without revealing her methods. Each disappearance had forced Bishop to adjust, spreading his remaining forces thinner while trying to maintain control. "It's time," she said, slinging the Winchester across her back. "Signal the Johnson brothers to execute Plan Thunder in exactly 30 minutes. Then get word to Caleb. Operation Flood begins on my signal." As Samuel departed to deliver these instructions, Eleanor descended from the roof to her private quarters. There, spread across her desk, lay the detailed intelligence she'd extracted from Rattler and the other captured men, combined with her own observations and the documents Abigail had provided. The complete picture revealed an operation far more extensive than she'd initially suspected. Bishop wasn't merely a criminal opportunist, but the architect of a sophisticated enterprise spanning 3 territories. His background as a Union Army officer had provided him the organizational skills and tactical thinking to build a network that blended criminal activities with seemingly legitimate businesses. More concerning was the identity of the colonel, Colonel William Hargrove, formerly of Army Intelligence, dishonorably discharged for selling military secrets, but never prosecuted, due to powerful connections in Washington. According to Rattler, Hargrove had joined Bishop's operation 6 months earlier, bringing with him specialized skills and contacts that had accelerated the organization's expansion. Eleanor studied the map of Redemption Springs one final time, mentally reviewing each phase of her plan. The odds remained heavily against them, 27 professional gunmen versus the handful of townspeople she'd organized into a defensive force. But numbers alone didn't determine outcomes, especially when the opposition faced an enemy they didn't fully understand. She changed quickly, exchanging her practical dress for the attire of her former profession: dark trousers, fitted vest with specialized pockets, and a long coat designed to conceal weapons while allowing swift access. Her matched Colts went into custom holsters, the Winchester slung across her back, and a variety of specialized tools secured in concealed positions throughout her clothing. The transformation was complete. Eleanor Wells, the respectable widow, who had run the Silver Spur for 7 years, had fully receded. In her place stood Quicksilver Blackwood, the legendary operative whose name had once been whispered with a mixture of awe and fear throughout the territories. She moved to the window, observing the position of the sun. 20 minutes until the Johnson brothers initiated Plan Thunder, the series of coordinated explosions that would create the impression of a major assault from the eastern ridge. The diversion would draw attention and forces away from the town center, creating the opening she needed for the next phase. A soft knock preceded Abigail Parker's entrance. The schoolteacher had also transformed overnight, her usual modest attire replaced by practical clothing suited for movement, her hair braided tightly to keep it secure. "The children and non-combatants are secure in the mine shaft," she reported. "Supplies for 3 days, armed guards at the entrance. If the worst happens, there's a secondary exit that leads to the high country." Eleanor nodded approval. "And the signal system?" "In place. 3 lantern flashes means it's safe to return. Any other pattern means stay hidden and wait for the marshals." Abigail hesitated, then asked the question that had clearly been weighing on her mind. "Do you think it will work? Your plan?" Eleanor met her gaze steadily. "It's not about certainty, Abigail. It's about creating circumstances where our strengths become decisive and their advantages become liabilities." Her expression softened momentarily. "But yes, I believe it will work. Bishop is intelligent and tactically sound, but he's also predictable, bound by conventional military thinking that sees confrontation in terms of force, meeting force. He won't anticipate our approach until it's too late." The schoolteacher studied her with newfound respect. "The stories about Quicksilver Blackwood, they didn't do you justice, did they?" A ghost of a smile touched Eleanor's lips. "Dime novels rarely capture reality. They prefer their heroes simple and their victories straightforward. The truth is usually more complex." As Abigail departed to take her position for the coming conflict, Eleanor made her final preparations. Every calculation had been made, every contingency considered. Now execution would determine the outcome. Exactly 30 minutes after Samuel had departed, the first explosion rocked the eastern ridge, followed in rapid succession by others that created the impression of a coordinated attack. Through her field glasses, Eleanor watched Bishop's men react with professional discipline, deploying in defensive formations, establishing firing positions, preparing to repel what they believed was a frontal assault. As she'd anticipated, Bishop split his forces, sending 15 men to secure the eastern approach while maintaining 12 in town to control key positions. The division of forces created the opening she needed. Eleanor activated the small signaling device she carried, sending the prearranged message to Caleb and his miners. Operation Flood would commence momentarily, adding another layer of confusion to Bishop's already divided attention. Moving with the fluid grace that had been her trademark, Eleanor descended to the main floor of the Silver Spur, where Thomas waited with the specialized equipment she'd prepared the previous night. "Remember," she instructed the young barkeeper, "timing is essential. When you hear the church bell, not before." Thomas nodded, his youthful face set with determination. "Yes, ma'am. And after?" "Fall back to the defensive positions we established. Don't try to be a hero. Your job is to maintain the confusion, not engage directly." She checked her weapons one final time. "Understood?" "Yes, ma'am," he repeated, though his expression suggested he might harbor aspirations beyond his assigned role. Eleanor placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Thomas, this isn't a dime novel adventure. Real combat isn't glorious or simple. Do exactly as we've planned, and we all have a better chance of surviving this." The young man's expression sobered as he nodded understanding. With a final reassuring squeeze of his shoulder, Eleanor moved to the saloon's concealed exit, the secret passage she'd built years earlier, anticipating that someday her past might catch up with her. Outside, Redemption Springs had transformed into a battlefield. The explosions on the eastern ridge continued, creating the impression of a major assault, while gunfire indicated Bishop's men engaging what they believed were attackers. In reality, the Johnson brothers were executing a carefully choreographed deception, creating the sounds and signs of combat without exposing themselves to actual danger. Eleanor moved through town, using the network of alleys and service passages she'd mapped over the years. Bishop's remaining men were focused outward, watching for threats approaching from obvious directions. None thought to look for danger emerging from within their perimeter. She reached her first objective, the church tower, without detection. From this vantage point, she could observe the entire town center, including the hotel where Bishop had established his headquarters. Through her specialized field glasses, she could see Bishop himself on the hotel's second floor, directing operations with the confidence of a military commander. Beside him stood the colonel, a distinguished man, with silver hair and an unmistakable bearing of authority. Their positioning, near the window with clear sightlines to the eastern approaches, made them perfect targets for a skilled marksman. But Eleanor hadn't come to assassinate. Her plan was more sophisticated, designed not merely to eliminate Bishop, but to dismantle his entire operation. She raised her hand, signaling to Caleb, who waited at his position near the water tower. The old prospector acknowledged with a brief flash of light from his signal mirror, then disappeared from view. Moments later, a rumbling sound emerged from beneath the town, the result of careful preparation during the night. Caleb and his miners had diverted the flow from Silver Creek, channeling it through abandoned mining tunnels that ran beneath Redemption Springs. Water began emerging from storm drains, flowing down the main street with increasing volume. Not enough to cause serious damage or endanger lives, but sufficient to create confusion and force Bishop's men to adjust their positions. More importantly, the unexpected flood drew attention downward, away from rooftops and upper stories where Eleanor's allies were taking their positions. Through her field glasses, Eleanor watched Bishop's reaction to this new development. His expression revealed momentary confusion before hardening into determination. He issued orders, redirecting some of his men to address the flooding while maintaining his focus on the eastern assault. Now came the critical moment. Eleanor drew her specialized rifle, Not the ornate Winchester she'd used in exhibitions, but a precision instrument designed for extraordinary accuracy at extreme ranges. She aligned the sights not on Bishop or his men, but on a specific target she'd identified during her preparation: the hotel's weather vane, a decorative metal rooster that adorned the highest point of the structure. The shot, when it came, was perfect. The weather vane exploded in a shower of metal fragments, creating a distinctive sound that resonated across the town center. To most observers, it would seem like a missed shot or random damage, but to Samuel, positioned in the Mercantile's bell tower, it was the signal to begin the next phase. The church bell began to toll, not the regular pattern that marked the hour, but an irregular, dissonant sequence that carried across the town. This was the signal Thomas and the other townspeople had been waiting for. Throughout Redemption Springs, seemingly ordinary objects began emitting dense smoke. The specialized devices Eleanor had prepared and her allies had positioned during the night. Within minutes, the town center was enveloped in swirling clouds that reduced visibility to mere feet, destroying the tactical advantage Bishop's men had established with their elevated positions. In the confusion, Eleanor moved. Descending from the church tower, she advanced toward the hotel with the confident precision of someone who could navigate by memory and sense rather than sight. The smoke that blinded Bishop's men was a familiar ally to her, having used similar techniques during her operations with the Pinkertons. Through the artificial fog, she could hear Bishop's men shouting, trying to maintain formation while dealing with the unexpected obscurement. Their disciplined response spoke to their training, but no training had prepared them for the systematic assault on their senses that Eleanor had orchestrated. She reached the hotel's rear entrance undetected, encountering a lone guard who never saw the shadow that emerged from the smoke behind him. Eleanor's strike was precise, not lethal, but efficiently incapacitating. She secured the unconscious man with practiced speed before entering the building. Inside, the hotel had been transformed into a command center, with maps and communications equipment spread across the main desk. 2 of Bishop's men manned this position, both visibly concerned by the chaos unfolding outside. They never noticed Eleanor's approach until her Colt pressed against the back of one man's neck. "Don't move," she instructed quietly. "Hands where I can see them." The men complied, professional enough to recognize when resistance would be futile. Eleanor secured them efficiently, using specialized restraints that would hold even the strongest opponent. "Second floor?" she asked, her voice carrying the expectation of immediate compliance. "Room 212, one man answered without hesitation, recognizing something in her tone that discouraged defiance. Bishop and the colonel, 2 guards outside the door. Eleanor nodded acknowledgement before rendering both men unconscious with precisely applied pressure to specific nerve points, a technique she'd learned years ago from a Chinese operative during a mission in San Francisco. The hotel's main staircase was exposed, an obvious approach. Instead, Eleanor located the service stairs used by staff, ascending silently to the second floor. Through a small window in the stairwell, she could see that the smoke was beginning to dissipate, which meant timing was becoming critical. Outside, the door to room 212, 2 guards stood at alert, their postures betraying military backgrounds. Eleanor assessed the situation with professional detachment, calculating angles and approaches. Direct confrontation would create noise, alerting Bishop and potentially triggering a more dangerous situation. Instead, she removed a small device from her specialized vest, a compressed gas projector of her own design, loaded with a compound that induced momentary disorientation without lasting harm. Taking careful aim from her concealed position, she activated the device. The guards responded instantly to the soft hissing sound, turning toward its source with weapons raised. But the fast-acting compound had already deployed, entering their respiratory systems before they could react. Both men collapsed, unconscious but unharmed, their weapons clattering to the floor. The noise, though relatively minor, was enough to alert the room's occupants. Eleanor moved swiftly, positioning herself beside the door with her Colt ready. As expected, the door opened moments later, a third guard emerging to investigate the disturbance. Her strike was lightning fast, the butt of her pistol connecting precisely with the base of the man's skull, rendering him unconscious before he registered her presence. Eleanor caught him as he fell, lowering him silently to the floor before turning her attention to the room beyond. Inside, Bishop and Colonel Hargrove stood before a map-covered table, both armed and alert to the danger. Bishop's hand moved toward his holstered revolver, but froze as Eleanor stepped into the doorway, her Colt aimed with unwavering precision. "I wouldn't," she advised quietly. "Not if you want to walk out of here." Bishop's expression shifted from alarm to calculated assessment as he recognized her. "Mrs. Wells," he acknowledged, his voice betraying no fear despite the circumstances. "Or should I say Quicksilver Blackwood? Your reputation doesn't do you justice." "Hands away from your weapons," Eleanor instructed, ignoring the comment. "Both of you, on the table where I can see them." Colonel Hargrove complied with the stiff dignity of a military man who recognized defeat. "Remarkable operation," he observed, studying Eleanor with professional interest. "Diversionary explosions, controlled flooding, smoke deployment, systematic isolation of our forces. West Point couldn't have planned it better." "Spare us the professional admiration, Colonel," Bishop said coldly, placing his hands on the table. "As instructed." "What now, Mrs. Wells? You've clearly outmaneuvered us, but surely you don't imagine you can arrest an entire organization." "That's exactly what's happening," Eleanor replied, her Colt never wavering. "5 of your men are already in custody. The rest are divided, disoriented, and facing armed townspeople who've had enough of your intimidation. Meanwhile, territorial. Marshals are en route with warrants for both of you and your entire operation, based on documentation that proves conspiracy, fraud, extortion, and murder across 3 territories." Bishop's composed facade cracked slightly, surprise flickering in his eyes. "Documentation? What documentation?" "Your operational ledgers, property records showing systematic fraud, banking transactions linking your legitimate businesses to criminal enterprises." Eleanor allowed herself a small, cold smile. "Did you really think you were the only one conducting reconnaissance, Mr. Bishop? While your men were making obvious displays of force, I was gathering the evidence that will dismantle your entire organization." Colonel Hargrove's military bearing slipped, his expression darkening with realization. "The school teacher, Parker's sister. That's how you got the territorial records." Eleanor didn't confirm or deny, maintaining her focus on the immediate situation. "You have one option, gentlemen. Surrender now. Order your remaining men to lay down their weapons and face justice through proper legal channels." Bishop's laugh held no humor. "Or what? You'll shoot us? 2 unarmed men? That doesn't align with the legend of Quicksilver Blackwood, the operative who always brought targets alive when possible." "Legends can be misleading," Eleanor replied, her voice cooling to a temperature that made both men tense instinctively. 7 years ago, I chose a different life. I buried Quicksilver Blackwood and became Eleanor Wells, a woman who valued peace over justice. But you threatened my home, endangered people under my protection, and brought violence to a community that offered me sanctuary." Her eyes hardened. "Don't assume you know what limits exist for me now." The standoff was interrupted by the sudden clamor of gunfire from the street below, not the controlled exchange that had characterized the earlier deception, but the chaotic sound of actual combat. Bishop's expression shifted to one of satisfaction. "It seems my men have regrouped sooner than you anticipated, Mrs. Wells. Perhaps your perfect plan isn't so perfect after all." Eleanor didn't allow the development to distract her. maintaining her position with professional focus. "Samuel!" she called, not taking her eyes off the two men before her. The big man appeared in the doorway behind her, his shotgun held ready. "Ma'am, secure these two. I'll handle the situation outside." As Samuel moved to take her place, Eleanor approached the window, assessing the situation in the street below. Several of Bishop's men had indeed regrouped, establishing a defensive position in front of the hotel and exchanging fire with townspeople who had taken cover behind barricades. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, moving toward the kind of direct confrontation she'd specifically designed her plan to avoid. Civilian casualties were now a real possibility. Eleanor made her decision in an instant, turning back to Bishop. "Call them off," she commanded, her voice carrying absolute authority. "Now." Bishop's smile was cold. "Or what?" In response, Eleanor raised her specialized rifle, sighting through the open window with preternatural calm. Her shot, when it came, was so precise it seemed impossible, the bullet striking a water barrel positioned above Bishop's men, releasing a torrent that disrupted their position without causing injury. Before the echo of the first shot had faded, she fired again. This time her bullet severed the rope, holding a stack of crates on the mercantile's loading dock. The crates crashed down, blocking the street and forcing Bishop's men to abandon their position or be trapped. "That was a demonstration," Eleanor stated flatly, leveling her rifle at Bishop himself. "The next shot won't be so considerate. Call them off." Bishop stared at her, reassessing the woman before him. What he saw in her unwavering gaze finally convinced him. Moving slowly to the window, he called out to his men below. "Stand down, all of you stand down and surrender your weapons." For a moment, it seemed his order might be ignored as gunfire continued. Then, gradually, the shooting ceased. Bishop's men emerged from their positions, hands raised in surrender as townspeople covered them with a variety of weapons. Eleanor maintained her vigilance, watching through her rifle scope as the remaining members of Bishop's operation were disarmed and secured. Only when the last man had surrendered did she lower her weapon, though her posture remained alert. "A remarkable conclusion to a remarkable operation," Colonel Hargrove observed, his professional assessment evident despite his compromised position. "You've systematically dismantled one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in the territories without a single fatality on either side. I don't know whether to be impressed or embarrassed." Eleanor didn't respond to the backhanded compliment, her attention already shifting to the next phase of her plan, securing the prisoners until the territorial marshals arrived, ensuring the townspeople remained safe, and beginning the process of returning Redemption Springs to normalcy. "Samuel, escort these two to the church basement with the others," she instructed. "Double guards, separate cells. I don't want them communicating with their men." As Samuel led the prisoners away, Eleanor moved to the window, surveying the town that had been her home for 7 years. The confrontation had left physical marks, damaged buildings, flooded streets, evidence of gunfire, but these could be repaired. What mattered was that Redemption Springs remained in the hands of its rightful citizens, free from Bishop's corruption. Below, she could see townspeople emerging from their defensive positions, embracing one another with the relief of those who had faced danger and emerged unscathed. Martha Hopkins was already organizing efforts to tend the wounded, none seriously injured, thankfully, while Caleb directed others to begin cleanup operations. Eleanor felt a complex mixture of emotions as she watched. For 7 years, she had suppressed Quicksilver Blackwood, believing that persona represented a life of violence and isolation she had left behind. Yet today, those same skills had protected the community that had become her true home. Perhaps Robert had been right all along. On his deathbed, He had taken her hand and whispered, "Don't bury who you are, Eleanor. Just find a better purpose for those skills." At the time, she'd interpreted his words as permission to return to her former life if she chose. Now she understood. He had meant something different, that her abilities could serve purposes beyond those for which they'd been developed. The sound of approaching horses drew her attention to the town's western approach. For a moment, her hand moved toward her holster, alert for new threats, but the riders who appeared carried the distinctive badges of territorial marshals, the legal authorities she'd summoned through Abigail's connections. The timing was perfect. Bishop and his entire organization were in custody, the town was secure, and evidence of the criminal enterprise was preserved for prosecution. Justice would be served through proper legal channels, bringing legitimacy to the operation she had orchestrated. As she descended to meet the marshals, Eleanor made a decision. Quicksilver Blackwood wouldn't disappear again, but neither would Eleanor Wells. Perhaps both could exist together, each serving different aspects of the life she had built. The precision shooter who could defend those in need, and the businesswoman who had found community and purpose in a small mining town. Redemption Springs had offered her sanctuary when she needed it most. Now she had returned that gift, protecting the town and its people from those who would exploit them. In doing so, she had perhaps found redemption of her own, integrating the different aspects of herself into a whole that was stronger than either part alone. The sun climbed higher over the mountains as Eleanor stepped into the street to greet the marshals. Behind her, the Silver Spur stood, as it always had, weathered but unbowed by the storm that had passed. Like its owner, the saloon had revealed unexpected strength when tested. Tomorrow, its doors will open again. Piano music would fill the evening air, glasses would clink, and the citizens of Redemption Springs would gather to share stories of the day a widow saloon keeper revealed herself to be the West's deadliest sharpshooter and saved their town in the process. But that was tomorrow. Today there was still work to be done, justice to be secured, and a community to heal. Eleanor Wells, or Quicksilver Blackwood, or perhaps simply Eleanor, straightened her shoulders and moved forward to meet whatever challenges awaited. After, all precision had always been her specialty. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.